Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight you are stepping into something older than almost anything you can imagine, a world that existed so long ago that even the word ancient feels like it barely covers the distance. You are stepping into the quiet hours of a civilization that stood for 3,000 years and spent a remarkable portion of that time thinking very carefully about sleep. Not sleep as a problem to be solved, not sleep as lost productivity. Sleep as a sacred thing, sleep as a doorway, sleep as the place where the gods spoke, where the dead returned, where the future arrived in whispers. So wherever you are right now, whether you are lying in bed with the lights turned low or sitting somewhere comfortable with the world going quiet around you, I want you to let your shoulders drop a little, let your breathing slow. Because for the next few hours, we are going to travel together to the banks of a river that has been flowing for millions of years, to a land where the sun rose with such certainty every morning that people built an entire religion around trusting it, and where night was not something to be feared but something to be entered carefully, respectfully, like stepping into a room where someone very important is sleeping. This is ancient Egypt's sleep secrets, and we are going to take our time getting there. Before we go any further, if you find yourself enjoying this kind of slow, detailed historical storytelling, the kind that takes you somewhere and leaves you there for a while, I want to gently encourage you to subscribe to this channel. It costs you nothing, and it means the next time we sit down together like this, you will know exactly where to find us. There is a subscribe button somewhere nearby. No rush, we have hours ahead of us. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Or rather, let us begin where any good Egyptian story should begin, at the edge of the Nile just before the sun comes up. In the blue-gray hour when the world is neither asleep nor awake. The river that never stops, the Nile, the land, and the shape of Egyptian time, the Nile is still moving. Even now, as you listen to this, that river is still doing what it has always done, flowing north through the desert, carrying silt from the mountains of Ethiopia down through Sudan, through Egypt, spreading out in a wide fan of green at the Mediterranean coast. It has been doing this for so long that the landscape itself is a product of the river's patience. Every field of barley, every grove of date palms, every mud brick wall in every village that ever stood along its banks, all of it exists because that river decided a very long time ago to overflow its banks once a year and leave behind something fertile. The Egyptians called the river Aitru, simply the river, as if there were no other rivers worth naming. And from their perspective, standing in the middle of the longest strip of habitable land surrounded by desert on both sides, that was essentially true. The Nile was not just a feature of the landscape. The Nile was the reason there was a landscape at all. And this matters for our story about sleep, about how the ancient Egyptians slept, what they dreamed, what they feared in the night, and what they hoped for when they closed their eyes, because everything in Egyptian life, including its rhythms of rest, was organized around the river. The flooding season was called Akhit. It ran roughly from what we would call July through October, though the Egyptians measured it differently, by the rising of a star rather than by the turning of a calendar page. Specifically, they watched for the appearance of Sopdet, the star we call Sirius, rising just before dawn on the eastern horizon. When Sopdet appeared, the flood was coming. And when the flood came, the fields disappeared under slow, brown water, and the farmers who worked those fields had very little to do. Think about what that meant for sleep. For a significant portion of every year, the people who grew Egypt's food were not growing food. They were waiting. The water was too high for planting, too thick with silt to wade through comfortably, and the rhythm of daily labor slowed to almost nothing. This was the time when pharaohs conscripted workers for building projects, not as slave labor as was once assumed, but as a kind of seasonal employment, feeding workers well and housing them in organized villages near the construction sites. But for many ordinary people, Akhit was also simply a slower time, a resting time. A time when the days were long and wet, and the nights came early, and the whole world seemed to breathe at half speed. Imagine it. A village on the edge of the floodplain sometime around 1200 BCE. The houses are simple structures, mud brick mostly, with thick walls that absorb the heat of the day and release it slowly through the night. The roofs are flat. The streets, such as they are narrow. At this time of year, the river has crept up to the edge of the village, and the air smells of wet earth and something slightly green, the smell of things beginning to grow even under the water. The people in this village wake early, not because they want to necessarily, but because the sound of birds begins before the sun does, and the walls of a mud brick house are not especially good at blocking sound. The hoopoe calls from somewhere nearby, that distinctive sound, almost like someone knocking gently on a wooden door. The ibis moves along the waterline. Ducks settle on the flooded fields in the early morning fog. Inside the house, the family is arranged in sleep. This is something we know a surprising amount about actually, not from records of specific families, but from the physical remains of Egyptian homes, from paintings, from tools found in sleeping areas, from the small objects that people kept near where they slept. The picture that emerges is intimate and specific and surprisingly familiar. The house itself is small by our standards. A typical working family in ancient Egypt might live in a space of 3 or 4 rooms. A main room that serves for eating, socializing and working, 1 or 2 sleeping rooms, and sometimes a small storage area. There might also be a staircase to the roof, and the roof was important. We will return to the roof many times in this story, because Egyptians spent a great deal of time on their roofs, especially in the hotter months and especially at night. The sleeping area, when it was a distinct room, was typically the farthest from the street, tucked back into the quiet interior of the house. Egyptian houses were designed to resist heat. The thick mud walls, the small high windows, the narrow corridors, and this natural insulation also made the sleeping areas quieter and darker than the outer rooms. There is something almost deliberately womb-like about the inner rooms of an Egyptian house. They were protected spaces, safe spaces. The kind of rooms where, even in the middle of a busy town, you could close your eyes and feel separated from the world outside. The beds themselves are worth pausing on. The Egyptians had beds. This might seem obvious, but it is worth saying clearly, because beds in the ancient world covered an enormous range of things, from simple reed mats on the ground to elaborate wooden frames with linen sheets and carved headrests. In Egypt, we find evidence of all of these at different social levels and different time periods. And what is interesting is how seriously the Egyptians took the bed as an object. The most characteristic piece of Egyptian sleeping furniture, and the one that most surprises modern people, is the headrest, not a pillow. A headrest. It looks at first glance like something you would not want to put your head on. It is a curved piece of wood or ivory or stone, shaped something like a small crescent moon mounted on a pedestal. The curve fits under the back of the neck rather than under the head itself, so that the sleeper's head is actually suspended slightly above the bed surface, supported by the neck rather than the skull. The result, if you have never tried it, is apparently not uncomfortable once you are accustomed to it. Many people in Africa and Asia still use similar headrests today, but it requires a particular way of sleeping, a particular stillness that is somewhat different from the loose, rolling sleep that a soft pillow encourages. Why a headrest? There were practical reasons. In a hot climate, keeping the head elevated off a surface prevents sweating against a mat. It keeps the hairstyle, and in Egypt, hair and wigs were taken seriously from being crushed. It keeps insects from crawling too close to the face in the night. But there were also spiritual reasons, and these are more interesting to us right now. The Egyptians believed that a person's head was particularly sacred. It was the seat of something vital, something that connected the physical body to the spiritual self. The head needed to be protected during sleep, when the soul, or rather, one of the several souls the Egyptians recognized, was free to wander. Keeping the head slightly elevated, slightly separate from the bed itself, was a way of preserving that protection, of maintaining a kind of dignity even in unconsciousness. Many Egyptian headrests were inscribed with protective spells. Some were carved to represent Bes, a dwarf god with a lion's face and a feathered crown, who was the protector of households and sleeping people, standing beneath the neck curve, holding it up like a tiny guardian. Others were inscribed with the names of protective deities or with simple prayers. May you sleep in peace. May your dreams be sweet. May you wake in health. These were not decorative flourishes. These inscriptions were understood to be active. The object once inscribed was believed to carry the words within it, to perform the prayer continuously throughout the night, regardless of whether the sleeper was conscious or not. You could fall asleep under the protection of a dozen guards, all of them carved in miniature, all of them watching through the darkness, all of them holding the words of safety in stone or ivory or wood. There is something very comforting about that idea, actually. The thought that the words of protection do not require your attention to work, that you can simply lie down and let them do their job. Let us talk about the broader landscape of Egypt for a moment, because the landscape was not just a backdrop to this civilization. It was actively shaping the way people thought about time, about rest, about the cycle of things. Egypt is a narrow country. You have probably heard it described as the gift of the Nile, and that is essentially what it is, a ribbon of green threading through the desert. On either side of that green ribbon, very close, almost visible from the center of any town, the desert begins. The Egyptians called the fertile land the Black Land Kemet because of the dark silt the river deposited. They called the desert the Red Land Desert for its color. And these two lands were not just geographic descriptions. They were moral and spiritual categories. The Black Land was life, order, the place where civilization happened, where crops grew, where the gods were properly honored. The Red Land was chaos, danger, the edge of things. It was not entirely evil, it had its own gods, its own power, but it was not a place where ordinary human life could be sustained. You went into the Red Land when you had to. You did not linger there. And here is something important: the dead were buried in the Red Land. The great necropolises, the cities of the dead, were built on the desert edge on the west bank of the Nile, because the west was where the sun went when it died each evening. The logic was elegant. The sun sets in the west, it descends into the darkness, it makes its journey through the underworld, it rises again in the east. The dead were laid in the west so that they too could make that journey, guided by the same geography that guided the sun. Sleep and death shared a vocabulary in ancient Egyptian thought. Not because they were considered the same thing, they were not, but because they were both understood as a temporary withdrawal from the visible world into a hidden one. When you slept, something of you went somewhere else. When you died, something of you went somewhere else. The somewhere else was the same place, or at least adjacent places, and the rules that governed safe travel in one were related to the rules that governed safe travel in the other. This is why the Egyptians took dreaming so seriously. Not as a curiosity, not as a private psychological event, but as an actual voyage into an actual place from which you could bring back real information, real warnings, real messages from beings who existed in that other realm. We will talk about dreaming in much more detail later, but for now I want you to hold on to that image, the sleeping person as a traveler, a temporary visitor to another world. Someone who needs, like any traveler, the right preparation, the right protection, and a clear path home. The seasonal rhythms of Egypt were divided into three periods: Akhit, the flood; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. Each of these seasons had its own character, its own quality of light and temperature and smell, and each influenced the way people slept. During Akhit, as we have already noted, the pace of life was slower. The fields were underwater. The air was humid and heavy with the smell of the river. Nights came early and stayed long. People slept more and probably more heavily, with the world muffled by the flood waters and the nights cooled by the river wind. During Peret, roughly our November through March, the fields emerged from the flood, covered in that rich black silt, and the real work began. Planting, irrigation, the constant labor of agriculture in a pre-industrial society. During this season, people rose before dawn and worked until the heat made it impossible, rested through the hottest part of the day in what was essentially a midday sleep, and then worked again in the cooler afternoon. This pattern, early rising, midday rest, afternoon return to work, early evening wind down, is documented not just in Egypt but across the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East, and it makes enormous physiological sense. The human body in a warm climate naturally wants a midday rest. The idea that sleep should be confined to one long block at night is a relatively modern invention, shaped by artificial lighting and industrial work schedules. The Egyptians, in other words, probably slept twice a day for much of the year, a long sleep at night and a shorter one in the heat of the afternoon, and they would not have experienced this as unusual or indulgent. It was simply the shape of the day. During Shemu, the harvest season, roughly April through June, the heat was at its most intense. This was the time of year when sleeping outdoors became not just pleasant but necessary. The inside of a mud brick house, which stays cool in the mild months, can become oppressive in high summer, especially at night when the walls release the heat they have absorbed through the day. The flat rooftops of Egyptian houses became sleeping platforms. Mats were carried up the stairs, headrests positioned, bodies arranged under the open sky with the stars overhead, and whatever breeze the night offered moving over skin. This was not considered roughing it. Sleeping on the roof in summer was the comfortable option. And there is something beautiful about that, an entire civilization lying under the sky in the warm nights. The Milky Way overhead, much more visible without electric light, stretching from one horizon to the other, the sound of the river somewhere below, the occasional call of a night bird, and all around you in every direction, other people doing exactly the same thing, breathing together in the dark. The stars mattered enormously to the Egyptians, and especially to their relationship with sleep and night. The Egyptians were careful observers of the sky. They developed a system for tracking time at night by watching the rising of specific stars on the horizon, stars they called the Deccan stars, organized into groups of 36, each group rising on the horizon for a 10-day period before being replaced by the next group. By watching which Deccan star was rising, an Egyptian astronomer or a priest, or simply someone who had paid attention to the sky long enough, could tell you approximately what time of night it was. This mattered for religious practice because certain rituals had to be performed at specific hours of the night. It mattered for navigation because the Nile did not stop being busy after dark, and traveling at night was sometimes necessary. And it mattered for the general organization of time because the Egyptians divided the night into 12 hours just as they divided the day into 12 hours. A system we still use today, though we have largely forgotten where it came from. But beyond their practical value, the stars had a deeper significance in Egyptian cosmology. The northern sky, specifically the stars that never set, the circumpolar stars that wheel around the pole star without ever dipping below the horizon, was understood to be the dwelling place of the blessed dead. The stars that never went away were the souls that had achieved immortality. When you lay on your rooftop and looked up at the sky, you were looking at the afterlife. You were sleeping under the faces of the transfigured dead. There is a particular star, or rather a group of stars, that the Egyptians associated with the sky goddess Nut. She was depicted as a woman arched over the earth, her body the sky itself, her fingertips touching the western horizon, her feet touching the eastern horizon. Each evening the sun god Ra entered her mouth, descended into her body, and traveled through her in darkness, being reborn each morning from between her legs in the east. The stars on Nut's body were the souls of the dead who had joined her in the sky. When Egyptians looked up at the Milky Way on a warm summer night, lying on their rooftops with the stars overhead, they were looking at Nut stretched above them, and at the souls of everyone who had ever lived and died and made that journey successfully. Sleep was not separate from all of this. Sleep was participation. Every night when you closed your eyes and entered the darkness, you were in a small way, a reversible way, doing what the dead did. You were entering the darkness. You were trusting the darkness to give you back. And every morning when you opened your eyes and saw the light returning, you were in a small way, a reversible way, experiencing the miracle that Ra experienced every dawn, the miracle of coming back. The architecture of rest, Egyptian homes, beds, and the design of sleep, and as the night deepens, let us go inside. Let us step through the doorway of an Egyptian home and look around carefully, the way you look around a room when you are seeing it for the first time, but also somehow recognizing it as if you have been here before in a dream. The doorway itself is important. Egyptian doorways, even in simple homes, were often marked. A small niche beside the door might hold a protective figure. The door frame might be inscribed with words or painted with images. The threshold was a liminal space, a between place, the line between outside and inside, between the public world and the private one. Crossing it mattered. You were entering a protected space. The main room of the house is cool and dim. The floor is packed earth, swept clean. There might be a low platform along one wall, a kind of built-in bench or daybed where people can sit or rest in the afternoon or receive guests. The walls might be plastered and painted, the colors faded now but once vivid, red and yellow ochre, white lime, the blue-green of faience. Not every house had painted walls, but the impulse to decorate was strong in Egyptian culture, present even in modest homes, a resistance to the plainness of mud and earth. There is a small window high on one wall letting in a rectangle of light. In the morning it is golden, in the afternoon white. In the evening it goes rose-colored and then deep blue, and then the room shifts entirely into lamplight. The lamps are oil lamps, small ceramic bowls filled with oil, usually sesame or castor oil with a wick of twisted plant fiber floating in it. The flame is small and steady unless a draft catches it. When it flickers, the shadows on the walls move and the room seems larger and less certain than it is in daylight. Paintings on the wall come alive slightly in the flickering light. The figures seem to breathe, to shift, to turn their painted faces just slightly. The smell of the lamp oil is distinctive, slightly bitter, slightly warm, with that quality that all fire has of smelling simultaneously ancient and immediate. The Egyptians also burned incense. Kaifi was the most famous Egyptian incense blend, a complex preparation of resins, herbs, wine, honey, and other ingredients, burned in temples but also in wealthy homes. Kaifi was believed to have specific effects on the mind and body, calming, clarifying, conducive to dreaming. Some ancient sources describe it as being burned specifically in the evening as a preparation for sleep. Whether or not every Egyptian home had access to Kaifi, it was expensive, requiring many ingredients and careful preparation. The idea that the transition to sleep should involve smell, should involve a shift in the quality of the air itself, is very Egyptian. The Egyptians were deeply engaged with smell. Their medical texts include recipes for aromatic preparations. Their religious rituals were saturated with incense. The smells of the two worlds, the living world and the divine world, were understood to be different, and using certain smells was a way of bridging them. So imagine the evening ritual. The lamp is lit. The day's work is done. Someone burns a small portion of incense, or perhaps just some dried herbs, lavender or chamomile, which grew along the Nile and were known to be calming, and the air changes. The quality of the light changes. The quality of the sound changes, because nighttime in an ancient village is different from daytime. Fewer voices, fewer animals, more wind, more water, more sky. The family settles. Children are put to bed first, usually in the inner room, sometimes on simple mats on the floor if beds are not available. Adults follow later, the order depending on who has to rise earliest, who has the longest walk to the fields, who has ritual obligations that require an early start. And then the house is quiet, and the lamps are extinguished or allowed to burn down, and the darkness comes in. Let us spend some time with the bed itself, because this is a topic that rewards patience. We know that Egyptians had beds, real beds, not just mats on the ground, from a very early period. Some of the oldest wooden furniture ever found comes from Egypt, preserved by the dry desert climate that has kept organic materials intact for thousands of years. Among this ancient furniture are beds, and they are remarkable objects. The earliest beds were simple, a wooden frame, sometimes with webbing of plant fibers strung across it to provide a slightly yielding surface, slightly elevated from the ground on short legs. The elevation served practical purposes, keeping the sleeper above the cold of the ground, above insects, above small creatures that moved along the floor in the night. Even a few inches made a significant difference, both physically and psychologically. By the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the era of Ramesses the Great and Tutankhamun and the great building projects at Karnak and Abu Simbel, Egyptian beds had developed considerably. Royal and wealthy beds were elaborate pieces of furniture, made of high-quality wood often imported, since Egypt itself did not have large forests. Inlaid with ivory or ebony or gilded with gold leaf, fitted with woven linen mattresses and fine linen sheets. Tutankhamun's tomb, which is our richest source of information about royal material culture because it survived largely intact, contained several pieces of furniture related to sleep. There were beds, one of them, his traveling bed, folds in 3 sections, a remarkably sophisticated piece of carpentry for any era. There were also what appear to be headrests and objects that may have been used in sleep-related rituals. But let us not spend too long in the palace. Let us think about the ordinary Egyptian bed. For most people, the bed was simpler but not primitive. A wooden frame with legs, sometimes with the legs carved in the shape of animal legs, lion's paws, bull's hooves, because these creatures had their own protective associations. A surface of woven plant fiber or leather strips. Over this, a mat of woven grass or papyrus, and the headrest, that distinctive Egyptian object positioned at the upper end. The Egyptians also slept with pillows, or at least with soft supports in some periods, and in some social classes, we find references to linen-filled cushions. But the headrest was the culturally significant object, the one that appeared in art and was inscribed with spells and was buried with the dead. The pillow was practical, the headrest was sacred. The position of sleep in Egyptian art is interesting. When the Egyptians depicted sleeping figures, and they did in various contexts, the figures were typically shown lying on their sides, one arm extended, the head resting on the curve of the headrest. This is consistent with what we know physiologically about headrest sleeping. It is most comfortable on the side, not on the back. The neck curve of the headrest is designed to fill the space between the bottom of the skull and the shoulder when the sleeper is on their side, preventing the neck from bending uncomfortably. It is also worth noting that this sleep position on the side with the knees slightly drawn up is a naturally protective position. It keeps the vital organs of the abdomen tucked against the surface of the bed or the body. It allows for quick rising. It positions the sleeper to hear and see what is in front of them. Sleep researchers today recognize the fetal position as one of the most instinctively preferred sleeping positions for humans, and the Egyptians, who were very attentive to the body's signals, seem to have settled on something close to it as their default. The sleeping room in an Egyptian house, when it was a distinct room, was typically small. This was not a limitation but a design choice. Small rooms are easier to heat in winter, easier to cool in summer. They are acoustically quiet. The sounds of the world outside are muffled by the surrounding walls. They are psychologically contained, womb-like safe. Egyptian homes in different periods and regions varied considerably in layout, but in the well-documented towns like Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built the Valley of the Kings, which has been so thoroughly excavated that we know its streets and houses almost room by room, the sleeping arrangements give us a detailed picture. Deir el-Medina is special because it is almost perfectly preserved. The village was built specifically to house the artisans and workers who constructed and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, starting around 1550 BCE. It sat in a desert valley between the Nile floodplain and the royal necropolis, and it was inhabited continuously for about 4 centuries before being abandoned when the New Kingdom ended. Because it was abandoned rather than built over, and because the dry desert climate preserved organic materials that would have rotted elsewhere, it has given archaeologists an extraordinary window into ordinary Egyptian life. The houses at Deir el-Medina were long and narrow, typically about 5 rooms arranged in a line from front to back, each room slightly different in function. The front room facing the street was the most public, a reception area, a place to meet visitors, often slightly elevated to distinguish it from the street. Behind it was a second room used for daily living, eating, working, socializing. Behind that, deeper in the house, were more private rooms, a bedroom, a storage area, and sometimes a small kitchen area at the back, partially open to the sky. The bedroom in a Deir el-Medina house was notable for one specific feature. It was often slightly elevated above the rest of the house, accessible by a step or two. This raised platform, sometimes called the lit close by Egyptologists, though it was not enclosed, served as the sleeping area. It was the highest point of the interior, both physically and symbolically. It was removed from the daily world of the house by those few inches of height, those few steps up. Some of these raised platforms had niches in the walls beside them, small recessed spaces where protective figures could be placed, where lamps could sit through the night, where a headrest could be stored during the day. The walls around these sleeping platforms were often painted with protective images. Bes, the guardian of sleep; Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who protected mothers and children; the serpent goddess Meritseger, who watched over the necropolis valley and whose protection extended to the sleeping workers who carved the tombs. These were not decorations, they were companions. They were presences that shared the sleeping room, that inhabited the walls and watched through the night. When you lay down in that small room and looked around you, you were surrounded by guardians. Every painted face was facing you. There is something in this that I find unexpectedly moving. The idea that the sleeping room should be a protected space surrounded by watching presences filled with words of care, it speaks to something very basic about what sleep requires. It requires trust. It requires the sense that you can lower your guard completely, that something or someone will hold the space while you are gone. The Egyptians understood this, and they built it into the architecture and the decoration of the sleeping room. Let us talk about temperature, because temperature shaped Egyptian sleep in ways that are hard to overstate. Egypt is hot. This is not a revelation. But the specific way Egypt is hot, the quality of that heat, its seasonal rhythms, its difference between noon and midnight, mattered enormously to how people organized their sleeping lives. During the hottest months, as we have noted, the rooftop was the preferred sleeping location. But the rooftop at night in Egypt is not just hot or cool. It is subject to something the Egyptians were deeply familiar with, the desert wind. The Khamsin, as it is now called in Arabic, or similar seasonal winds in ancient times, could blow hot and dry from the south, carrying fine desert dust that settled on everything and irritated the eyes and throat. In these conditions, sleeping outside was uncomfortable in a different way, not from heat but from grit and dryness. In the cooler months, and Egypt does have cool months, particularly in the north, where winter nights can drop to genuinely cold temperatures, sleeping arrangements moved inside and the household arranged itself for warmth. Linen was the primary fabric of Egyptian life, fine and breathable in summer, layered for warmth in winter. Wool was also used, though less favored by Egyptians who associated it somewhat with foreigners. Animal skins were used in earlier periods and in simpler households. The basic Egyptian sleeping kit, if we can call it that, headrest mat, some form of covering, was adaptable to a remarkable range of conditions. It could be carried to the roof in summer and brought back inside in winter. It could be packed for travel. It could be set up quickly almost anywhere. This portability was important in a society where seasonal labor meant seasonal movement, workers following the construction projects, farmers moving to different tasks, merchants traveling the river. The flexibility of Egyptian sleep culture, the willingness to sleep in different locations, different configurations, different hours of the day, reflects a relationship with sleep that was practical and responsive rather than rigid. Sleep was not a fixed appointment that happened in a fixed place at a fixed time. Sleep was a condition that the body entered when it needed to, and that the culture supported in multiple ways throughout the cycle of the day and year. Let us pause here and look at one specific place in Egypt that tells us a great deal about how people actually slept: the royal palace. The palaces of ancient Egypt were in many ways scaled-up versions of ordinary houses, following the same logic of inner and outer spaces, public and private, exposed and protected. But they were also something more. They were cosmological statements, representations of the ordered world designed to express the right relationship between the pharaoh, the gods, and the cosmos. The sleeping quarters of the pharaoh occupied the deepest, most protected part of the palace. This is both practical safety, privacy, and symbolic. The pharaoh, as the son of Ra, needed particular protection during sleep, because during sleep he was at his most vulnerable, his divine essence temporarily separated from his physical body. The wrong conditions, the wrong influences could compromise not just the pharaoh's personal well-being but the cosmic order itself. The pharaoh's bedroom was therefore surrounded by rings of protection, physical guards, sacred objects, inscribed doorways. Designated priests whose job it was to perform protective rituals before the pharaoh retired each night. The room itself was oriented carefully, often facing east, so that the morning sun would enter the sleeping space as the first light of dawn, a reminder of Ra's eternal return. Inside the royal bedroom, the bed was more than furniture. It was a ritual object. Before the pharaoh could sleep, certain procedures had to be performed. The bed had to be properly prepared, protective formulas recited, specific incenses burned. After the pharaoh slept, there were procedures for waking as well: the first light, the first words, the formal acknowledgement of another sunrise successfully achieved. This elaborate ritual around sleep tells us something important. The Egyptians understood that sleep itself was powerful, that it was not a neutral event but an active one, full of possibilities, both beneficial and dangerous. The level of ritual protection applied to the pharaoh's sleep was the most extreme version of something that existed in more modest forms in every Egyptian household. Every headrest inscription, every painted guardian on the bedroom wall, every evening prayer before lying down, these were all versions of the same thing: preparation for the journey, recognition that sleep was going somewhere and that going somewhere required care. In the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, we find something that is almost more interesting than the royal palaces: the records of ordinary people. The Egyptians were great record keepers, even at the village level. The workers of Deir el-Medina kept journals of absences, detailed lists of who did not show up to work on a given day and why. And these records, preserved on pieces of pottery and stone called ostraca, are remarkable documents. They tell us that workers were absent for reasons including illness, family obligations, and this: he is sleeping, not he is resting, not he is ill, simply he is sleeping. Listed matter-of-factly alongside legitimate reasons for absence, without apparent embarrassment or moral judgment. The act of sleeping could simply prevent a man from coming to work, and this was acceptable to document. We also find in these records references to a practice we might call the ritual rest, a day of absence taken specifically for religious purposes, during which normal labor was suspended and certain observances were performed. The Egyptians had a 7-day week, not our 7-day week, which comes from a different tradition, but a 10-day cycle within their calendar that served a similar function. And there were regular festival days throughout the year, of which there were many. On these days, work in the necropolis typically stopped. People stayed home or participated in community gatherings or performed private rituals, and they rested. The proportion of the year that was designated as festive, as officially not for working, was, by modern standards, quite high. Estimates based on the Deir el-Medina records suggest that workers might have had as many as 60 to 65 rest days per year beyond their normal rest days. This does not make ancient Egyptian laborers leisured. The work, when they did it, was physically demanding, done without machinery, requiring enormous human effort. But it suggests a civilization that had built rest into its calendar in a systematic way, that understood rest not as a luxury to be earned, but as a structural element of a well-organized human life. What the gods said in the dark dreams, divination, and the Egyptian understanding of the sleeping mind, and as the night deepens further, let us talk about what happened when the eyes closed. For the ancient Egyptians, the dream was not a private experience. It was not a quirk of neurology, not the brain processing memories, not random firing of neurons in the dark. The dream was a communication, a visitation, an arrival of something from elsewhere. And what that something was: divine message, demonic threat, ancestral voice, prophetic vision, depended on the dream's content, its imagery, the way it made you feel, and what it required of you when you woke. The Egyptians had a sophisticated understanding of dreams that developed over thousands of years and left behind a remarkable body of written evidence. Among the most important of these documents is the Chester Beatty papyrus, dating to around 1275 BCE, discovered in the Valley of the Kings and now housed in the British Museum. This document is what scholars call a dream manual, a text that catalogues different dream scenarios and interprets their meanings. The Chester Beatty papyrus is a strange and wonderful document. It is organized as a list. If a man dreams of X, it means Y. The list is long and specific and sometimes very surprising. Some examples: if a man sees himself in a dream drinking warm beer, it is good, it means the joy of his heart. If a man sees himself in a dream with his face in a mirror, it is bad, it means another wife. If a man sees himself in a dream looking out of a window, it is good. It means the hearing of his cry by his God. If a man sees himself in a dream with his bed on fire, it is bad. It means the driving away of his wife. If a man sees himself in a dream mounting a horse, it is good. It means being proud before his peers. These entries go on for page after page, covering hundreds of dream scenarios, ranging from the mundane, seeing a field, seeing an animal, seeing a familiar person, to the extraordinary, flying through the air, speaking with a god, descending into the underworld. Each entry is classified as either good or bad and given a brief interpretation of what the dream portends for the waking life of the dreamer. What is immediately striking about this text is its tone. It is matter of fact. It does not treat the dreams it describes as unusual or alarming. It treats them as ordinary occurrences that happen to ordinary people and require interpretation the way any other event requires interpretation. This tone implies a culture in which dreaming and the careful examination of dreams was a regular part of life, not an exotic speciality. The text is also organized in a way that suggests it was used as a reference. You would look up your dream in the list and find its meaning, the way you might consult a dictionary. This implies that someone was regularly doing this consulting, waking in the morning, recalling the dream, comparing it to the list, drawing conclusions about the day or period ahead. This was not an occasional activity for special circumstances. This was a practice woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. The Egyptians distinguished between different kinds of dreams based on how they arrived and what they meant. This is a distinction that also appears in the dream traditions of other ancient cultures, Greek, Mesopotamian, Hebrew, but the Egyptian version is particularly detailed. There were, broadly speaking, three categories. The first was the prophetic dream, a dream that showed you something that would happen. These were typically vivid, clear, and easy to remember upon waking. They often involved recognizable people and places, and their meaning was either self-evident or could be determined by a specialist. Prophetic dreams were taken seriously at every level of society, from the village farmer who dreamed of a good flood and started planning his planting accordingly, to the pharaoh who dreamed of a god appearing before a battle and took it as divine endorsement of his military plans. The second category was the message dream, a dream in which a god, a deceased ancestor, or some other non-human entity appeared and directly communicated something to the sleeper. These were perhaps the most valued kind of dream because they required no interpretation. The god spoke, you listened, you remembered. The message dream was direct communication between the divine and the human, mediated only by the condition of sleep. The third category was the troubled dream, the nightmare, the confused or disturbing vision, the dream that left you feeling wrong when you woke. These were understood not as meaningless experiences, but as significant ones, warnings sometimes, or the result of a spiritual problem that needed to be addressed. If you were having repeated troubled dreams, this was a sign that something in your spiritual life required attention. A ritual not properly performed, an ancestral shade not properly honored, a divine being who had been inadvertently offended. The responses to troubled dreams were practical. There were rituals for dissolving the effects of a bad dream, for purifying yourself after a disturbing night vision, for preventing the bad dream from manifesting in waking life. These rituals typically involved water. Purification by water was deeply embedded in Egyptian religious practice, and specific words spoken either by the dreamer or by a priest. There were also texts specifically designed to prevent bad dreams, protective formulas that a person might recite before sleep, or have written on papyrus and placed under the pillow, or rather under the headrest, or have inscribed on an object kept near the sleeping area. These formulas typically invoked specific deities associated with the protection of sleep and addressed the potential sources of bad dreams directly, dismissing them from the sleeping space. One such formula, roughly translated, goes something like this: "Get back, you who come in darkness, who creep in with your nose to the back of the head and your face turned toward the sleeper who comes for them that sleep. Come not against me in my sleep." This is addressed to something, some entity or force that approaches sleeping people. The description is specific enough to make modern readers slightly uncomfortable. Something that comes in darkness, that approaches from behind, that specifically targets sleepers. The formula dismisses this thing, turns it away, asserts the sleeper's protection. What was this entity? We cannot say with certainty. The Egyptians described a wide range of potentially dangerous beings that operated in the night and in dreams. Some were malevolent dead, shades of people who had died badly and not found peace. Some were minor hostile spirits, some were aspects of chaos itself, the enemy of the ordered world. Whatever specific entity this formula was designed to address, the important thing is the mechanism, knowledge of the threat, naming of the threat, and ritual dismissal of the threat. The sleeper was not helpless. The sleeper had tools. The practice of seeking dreams deliberately, of sleeping in a sacred space in order to receive a divine message, is called incubation, and it was one of the most important dream practices in the ancient world. The Egyptians practiced it, and they had specific temples and sacred sites designed for it. The process of dream incubation in its Egyptian form typically worked like this. A person, usually someone with a problem that required divine guidance, an illness, a legal dispute, a decision about marriage or business or warfare, would identify an appropriate deity to approach. They would then travel to the temple or sacred site associated with that deity. At the temple, they would perform specific preparatory rituals, purification by water, fasting, prayer, possibly the wearing of special garments. They would bring offerings, food, drink, incense, perhaps a small object to present to the deity. Then in the proper time they would sleep, in the sacred space of the temple or in a designated sleeping area attached to it, or sometimes directly before the statue or image of the deity. They would lie down and wait for the god to come to them in a dream. The dream that arrived was understood to be the god's response. It might be clear and direct, the god appearing in a recognizable form and speaking plainly. It might be symbolic imagery that required interpretation. It might be felt rather than seen, a sense of presence, a warmth, a voice that could not quite be heard but that left an impression upon waking. Whatever form it took, the incubation dream was understood as a genuine divine communication, and it was taken seriously in whatever practical decisions followed. Several Egyptian temples have been identified as incubation sites, or as having significant incubation practices associated with them. The temple complex at Memphis, associated with Imhotep, the historical architect and physician who was later deified and became a healing god, was known as a place where people came specifically to sleep and receive healing dreams. Imhotep's association with medicine and wisdom made him a natural deity to approach for dreams of healing, and the Egyptians who slept in his precincts were seeking diagnoses, cures, prescriptions, and divine medical guidance delivered through the medium of sleep. There were also smaller, more local incubation sites, sacred trees, particular wells, the tombs of specific individuals who were believed to have become powerful spiritual intermediaries after death. These were not formal temple complexes but charged places, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the divine world was thinner than usual, where the dream was more likely to carry genuine information. The underlying assumption of all of this, the assumption that makes incubation make sense as a practice, is that sleep is a state of genuine contact with the divine, that in sleep the conditions are right for communication to occur that cannot occur in waking life. Waking, we are too dense, too caught up in the material world, too surrounded by noise and distraction. Asleep, something opens, something becomes possible. Let us talk about some specific dreams recorded in Egyptian history, because they are fascinating documents, not just of what people dreamed, but of how they understood and reported their dreams. The most famous Egyptian dream is probably the Sphinx dream, or more precisely the dream of Thutmose IV, recorded on a stele that stands between the paws of the Great Sphinx at Giza and can still be read today by anyone who visits. The story goes like this. Thutmose, who was not yet pharaoh, was a young prince out hunting in the desert near Giza. The desert in the vicinity of the pyramids was not what it is today. It was not a tidy archaeological site with fences and souvenir stands. It was a vast, somewhat mysterious landscape of ancient monuments, most of them considerably buried by sand, with the Great Sphinx visible but only partly uncovered, its body half swallowed by the desert that had been encroaching for centuries. According to the stele, the young prince stopped to rest in the shade of the Sphinx, which he could reach because enough of its head was uncovered to provide shade, and fell asleep. And in his sleep, the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and spoke. The Sphinx, speaking as the sun god Harmakis, whose image it was, told the prince that if he cleared the sand from the Sphinx's body, the god would make him pharaoh. It was a bargain, essentially. Do this thing for me and I will give you this other thing. Thutmose woke, cleared the sand, a massive project requiring considerable labor, and according to the official story, subsequently became pharaoh. The stele was erected to commemorate this event, and it stands there still between the paws of the Sphinx, telling the story of the dream that changed history. Now there is considerable scholarly debate about how much of this story is historical fact and how much is political narrative, a later justification for a claim to the throne that needed divine backing. But this debate, interesting as it is somewhat beside the point for our purposes. The important thing is that the story was told. It was told as though it was plausible. It was told as though a young man falling asleep in the desert and being addressed by a god through a dream was a completely reasonable thing to report as a historical event, because from the Egyptian point of view it was. Another remarkable dream record comes from Ramesses II, the great pharaoh who ruled for 66 years, fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, and covered more of Egypt with his image than any other ruler. At Kadesh, the Egyptian army was nearly defeated, ambushed by Hittite forces in a situation that became dangerously close to disaster. Ramesses, in his own account of the battle, describes how he rallied his troops and fought his way out through what he presents as near miraculous personal valor. But before the battle, in the Egyptian version of events, Ramesses received a dream. The god Amun appeared to him and promised him divine support. Amun was the king of the gods during the New Kingdom period, the most powerful deity in the Egyptian pantheon at that time, and his promise of support was not a small thing. It was the highest possible divine endorsement. The dream came at the right moment the night before the crisis, and it was understood by Ramesses, or at least presented by him, as a genuine communication that informed his actions in the battle. He knew, because Amun had told him so in a dream, that he would prevail. Whether this knowledge gave him actual courage or simply gave him a narrative framework in which courage was required and rewarded, the outcome was the same. He fought, he survived, he won a negotiated peace. The dream, in this political and military context, served several functions simultaneously. It was a genuine religious experience, or understood to be one. It was also a morale builder for Ramesses personally, and when reported to his troops, for them as well. And it was a political statement, a claim of divine favor that justified his rule and his decisions. Dreams in the Egyptian context were never just private. They were public documents, potentially with political and religious weight. Beyond the famous dreams of pharaohs, there was a rich tradition of dream consultation at every level of Egyptian society. We know from papyri and ostraca, the pottery shards used for everyday writing, that ordinary people consulted dream interpreters. These were specialists, sometimes attached to temples, sometimes independent practitioners, who were consulted the way we might consult a doctor or a lawyer. When you had a problem that required expertise, dream interpretation was a recognized profession in ancient Egypt. The practitioners, sometimes called those who know dreams, were expected to have knowledge of the dream manuals like the Chester Beatty III papyrus, to understand the symbolic vocabulary of the dream world, and to be able to advise clients on what ritual responses were appropriate in response to specific dream types. The consultation probably worked something like this. You wake in the morning with a dream that concerns you, vivid, disturbing, hard to dismiss. You describe it to the interpreter as completely as you can, trying to capture not just the images but the sequence, the emotional tone, the sense of the thing. The interpreter listens carefully, asks questions, considers. Then they give you an interpretation and often a recommended response, a ritual, a prayer, a particular offering, an action to take or avoid in your waking life. The fees for this service would have been in kind, food, goods, labor, and varied depending on the complexity of the interpretation and the social standing of the practitioner. Temple dream interpreters would have been more prestigious and probably more expensive than village practitioners. What is interesting is that this system placed enormous value on dream content, on the specific imagery and emotional quality of dreams, as information about the state of a person's relationship with the divine world. Bad dreams were not embarrassments to be suppressed, they were diagnostic information. Good dreams were not casual pleasantries, they were confirmations of divine favor. Every dream was worth examining, every night was potentially full of messages. This is a fundamentally different relationship with sleep than the one most of us have today. We tend to think of dreams as byproducts of sleep, interesting sometimes, disturbing occasionally, but essentially peripheral to the main business of rest and recovery. For the Egyptians, the dream was the main event, sleep was the vehicle, the dream was the destination. The hour of best, sleep guardians, night demons, and the spiritual architecture of rest. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, there was a god with a ferocious face who loved children. Bes is one of the most distinctive figures in the Egyptian pantheon, and one of the most lovable once you get past the initial impression. He looks at first glance frightening, a dwarf figure with a leonine face, a protruding tongue, a feathered crown, often depicted wielding knives or musical instruments in a posture of aggressive protection. His image was not placed on great temple walls with other deities. He was a household god, an intimate god found in the home rather than the official cult. Bes's primary function was protection. He protected women in childbirth and the newborn child. He protected against dangerous animals, scorpions, snakes, the small creatures that moved at night. He protected against illness, and he protected sleep. His face was frightening by design. The leonine grimace, the protruding tongue, the aggressive posture, these were not meant to frighten the people of the household. They were meant to frighten the things that threatened the household. Bes stood at the threshold of safety and looked outward toward the darkness, toward the chaos, with a face that said, "Nothing harmful passes here." His image was placed in bedrooms. It was carved into furniture, bed frames, headrests. It was stamped onto ceramic vessels and amulets. Pregnant women wore Bes amulets. Children were given Bes amulets. Sleeping people lay under the gaze of Bes, carved in wood or stone or ivory, standing between them and whatever the night contained. There is something deeply human about Bes. He is not remote and magnificent like Ra or Osiris or Amun. He is right there in the room at human scale, doing a specific and practical job, keeping the night safe. He is the divine equivalent of a nightlight, not the sun itself, but a smaller, warmer domestic light that makes the darkness manageable. Bes was often paired with Taweret, another household deity whose appearance was equally surprising and equally protective. Taweret was depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, with the legs of a lion, the tail of a crocodile, and heavy pendulous breasts. She held in one hand the Sa symbol of protection, and in the other often a lit torch or a knife. Taweret was specifically associated with childbirth and the protection of mothers and children, but her protective remit extended to sleep, particularly the sleep of the vulnerable, pregnant women, newborns, the sick. Her image was found in bedrooms, on headrests, on amulets worn during sleep. The hippopotamus was, in Egyptian eyes, a creature of enormous power. It was dangerous, aggressive, capable of killing with terrifying speed and force. But the pregnant hippopotamus was something more than just powerful. It was power in the service of new life, protective in the most primal way. Taweret channeled that power into domestic protection. She was fierceness in the service of tenderness. A guardian who could not be intimidated because she was fiercer than anything that might threaten. Together, Bes and Taweret occupied the Egyptian bedroom the way we might have a smoke detector and a lock on the door. Practical, reliable presences whose value was mostly invisible until it was needed. You slept easily because they were there. You did not think about them much during the day. But when night came and you lay down in the dark, their presence in the room was a specific comfort. There were also more specialized sleep guardians. Meritseger, she who loves silence, was a cobra goddess whose presence was felt particularly in the Theban necropolis and its surrounding area, which included Deir el-Medina. She was the spirit of the peak that dominated the skyline above the Valley of the Kings, a pyramid-shaped natural mountain that brooded over the workers' village like a benevolent authority. She was invoked by workers who fell ill, who had accidents, who suffered from troubles of conscience. She was also associated with the silence of the necropolis, the silence of the dead, the silence of sleep. The name "She who loves silence" is worth sitting with. It suggests a deity who was drawn not to noise and activity but to the quality of stillness. A goddess who chose the quiet, who found something sacred in the absence of sound. Who inhabited exactly the kind of space, the sleeping house, the pre-dawn desert, the necropolis at night, where silence was not emptiness but presence. Now let us talk about what the Egyptians feared in the night, because fear is part of the story of sleep, and the Egyptians did not pretend otherwise. The night in ancient Egypt was genuinely dangerous in ways we have largely insulated ourselves from. Scorpions were common and their stings could be fatal, particularly in children and the elderly. Snakes moved at night. The desert, even near the Nile, harbored things that could kill you if you encountered them unprepared. Illness could arrive in the night, fever rising with the darkness, a child who was fine at sunset burning and delirious by morning. But beyond the physical dangers, there were spiritual ones. The night was the time when the protective order of the day relaxed slightly, when the margins between the world of the living and the world of the dead became more permeable. The Egyptians were not unique in believing this. Nearly every pre-modern culture has understood night as the time when other kinds of things move. But the Egyptians had a particularly detailed and elaborate understanding of what those things were. The most dangerous beings of the Egyptian night were the dead who had not found peace. Egyptian mortuary religion was extremely concerned with the proper management of the dead, the elaborate preparations, the tomb construction, the ritual objects. The prayers and spells of the Book of the Dead were all designed to ensure that the dead person made a successful transition to the afterlife and did not remain trapped and dangerous in the world of the living. When these preparations failed, when someone died badly without proper burial, without the proper rites, they could become malevolent presences in the world they had left behind. These unquiet dead might approach sleeping people. They might appear in dreams, bringing illness or misfortune. They might attach themselves to houses, to particular locations, to surviving family members. And they needed to be managed sometimes through ritual placation, sometimes through direct ritual expulsion. One of the most common responses to illness in ancient Egypt was to identify its cause as the work of a hostile dead person and to perform rituals to address this. Physicians and magical practitioners often worked in concert. The physical symptoms were treated with medication, while the spiritual cause was addressed with ritual. This was not, from the Egyptian perspective, contradictory. Disease could have both a physical component and a spiritual one, and treating only one while ignoring the other was incomplete medicine. The specific rituals for dealing with dangerous night presences were numerous and varied. Some involved the use of particular herbs or incenses believed to repel hostile beings. Some involved specific protective amulets. Some involved elaborate spoken formulas. And some involved a practice that appears repeatedly in the magical texts, the construction of magical traps or barriers around the sleeping person. These barriers were typically established through ritual, drawing a circle, speaking words, placing objects at the four cardinal directions around the sleeping space. The logic was explicitly spatial. The hostile being occupied the space outside, the sleeping person occupied the space inside, the barrier prevented crossing. Once the barrier was established through the correct ritual procedure, it was understood to be real, not metaphorically real, actually real. The hostile being could not cross it. This kind of spatial magic, the creation of a protected interior through ritual, is one of the most widespread human responses to the fear of sleep. It appears in cultures across the world and across time, in forms ranging from the elaborate to the simple. The Egyptian version was sophisticated, detailed, and embedded in a rich theological and practical tradition. But its basic logic was the same as a child pulling a blanket over their head. The creation of a defined inside that is separate from the threatening outside. The relationship between the Egyptians and the dead was complicated and intimate in ways that shaped the entire culture's relationship with sleep and night. The dead were not gone. This is the fundamental Egyptian understanding that everything else builds on. The dead had changed their mode of existence, moved to a different realm, undergone transformations that the living could not undergo and survive, but they were still present. They could be addressed, they could be petitioned, they could answer. The evidence for this comes from a remarkable class of documents called letters to the dead, actual letters, written on papyrus or pottery, addressed to deceased relatives, describing the writer's problems and asking for help. These letters were placed in tombs or near the bodies of the dead, delivered through the physical proximity of the text to the body. Some of these letters are poignant in the extreme. A widower writing to his dead wife, begging her to stop troubling him with illness, asking what he has done to deserve her anger. A mother writing to her dead husband, asking him to intercede in a legal dispute that is threatening the family. These letters were written by real people in emotional distress, reaching across the boundary of death to people they had loved, and they were written in complete seriousness. The expectation, or at least the hope, was that the dead person would receive the message, would understand it, and would do something about it, would advocate, would intercede, would come in a dream and provide guidance. The dream was the primary channel through which the dead communicated with the living. If you wrote a letter to a dead relative and they received it, they might respond in a dream. If you had a dream that seemed to contain a message from a deceased person you had known and loved, that was genuinely understood as contact with that person, not a psychological artifact, not a wish fulfillment fantasy. A real encounter with a real being in a real realm mediated by the specific conditions of sleep. This understanding meant that sleep was not just rest, it was also the primary opportunity for contact with the dead. Every night when you closed your eyes, you were entering a space where the people you had lost were potentially accessible. This gave sleep a quality of opportunity that goes beyond anything we typically associate with it. The night was not just time to be unconscious. The night was visiting hours. Let us talk about the Egyptian concept of the soul, because it is directly relevant to what was understood to happen during sleep, and because it is one of the most fascinating and carefully developed ideas in the entire history of human thought about consciousness. The Egyptians did not believe in a single soul. They believed in multiple aspects of the self, each with its own name, nature, and function, and each responding differently to the conditions of sleep, death, and the afterlife. The most important of these for our purposes are the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was the life force, the animating energy that distinguished the living from the dead. It was often depicted as a pair of raised arms, the hieroglyph that represented it also being the gesture of an embrace. The Ka was received at birth and departed at death. During life it needed to be sustained by food and drink, hence the elaborate food offerings placed in tombs. The Ka of the dead was fed by the offerings left by the living. Without this sustenance, the Ka could fade and the dead would suffer. During sleep, the Ka was understood to be present, but in a different mode. The sleeping body still had its Ka. Sleep was not death, even though it resembled it, but the Ka was temporarily less active, less engaged with the material world. This was why sleep had some of the qualities of death without being death. The Ka was there, but quieter. The Ba was something more complex and more interesting. The Ba is often translated as soul, but this translation is misleading because the Ba is not the intangible spiritual essence that soul implies in most Western religious contexts. The Ba was more like the individual personality, the specific self of a specific person, their character, their memories, their unique being. It was depicted as a bird with a human head, typically the head of the person whose Ba it was. The Ba was what moved. It was mobile in ways the Ka was not. During sleep, the Ba could leave the body, travel to other places, visit the world of the dead, encounter other beings, receive messages. It was the Ba that dreamed. It was the Ba that made the dream journey possible. This is why the sleeping body had to be protected during sleep, because the Ba was gone and the body, without the active presence of the Ba, was somewhat vulnerable. The protective objects around the sleeping area were protecting the body during the Ba's absence, ensuring that it had a safe place to return to when the dream journey was complete. This also explains why sudden waking was considered somewhat dangerous in Egyptian thought. If the Ba was in the middle of a journey and was suddenly called back too abruptly, by a loud noise, by a physical shock, the return might be disorienting, potentially harmful. The transition from sleep to waking was ideally gradual, allowing the Ba to return at its own pace, to reintegrate with the body completely before the demands of waking life resumed. The concept of the Ba also explains why the Egyptians were so careful about what happened immediately upon waking. The first moments of the morning, when the Ba had just returned, when the dream images were still present, when the mind was balanced between the two worlds, were considered particularly significant. Dreams that were remembered upon waking were the most recent messages from wherever the Ba had been. They deserved careful attention before the business of the day erased them. There was a specific ritual moment in the Egyptian day that was directly concerned with this transition from sleep to waking, and it was called the opening of the mouth. You may have heard of the opening of the mouth ceremony in the context of death and mummification. It was the ritual performed on the mummy that was understood to reactivate the senses of the deceased, enabling them to breathe, eat, see, and speak in the afterlife. But this ceremony had its roots in something more everyday, the ritual of reactivating the senses each morning after sleep. The morning for the Egyptians required re-establishment. The night had been a kind of temporary death, a withdrawal of active consciousness from the world. The return of consciousness in the morning was a resurrection, small, reversible, but real. And like any resurrection, it benefited from acknowledgement, from ritual, from the deliberate marking of the threshold. The morning rituals of ordinary Egyptians were simpler than the elaborate temple and royal ceremonies, but they followed the same logic. You woke. You acknowledged the light, the return of Ra, the miracle of another sunrise successfully accomplished. You performed some form of ablution, physical and spiritual. You addressed any dreams you had brought back from the night. You reoriented yourself to the living world. In temples, the morning ritual was elaborate. The god statue, the physical form in which the deity resided, was awakened each morning by priests who opened the inner sanctuary, lit incense, offered food, spoke specific words of waking and invocation. The god, like a person who had been sleeping, needed to be reactivated, brought back into full presence and power, made ready for the business of another day. The parallel between the god's morning ritual and the human's morning ritual was deliberate. The Egyptians were very good at thinking in parallels, at understanding human and divine experience as versions of the same patterns. The god slept, the human slept. The god woke to the light of Ra, the human woke to the light of Ra. The god was restored to power each morning, the human was restored to consciousness each morning. The difference was one of scale and significance, not of kind. This parallel gave the morning its ritual weight. Rising was not just rolling out of bed. Rising was a small ray creation, a participation in the cosmic pattern of death and renewal that the sun enacted every day. The physician and the dreamer, Egyptian medicine, sleep, and the healing arts, and as the night deepens once more, let us turn to the healers. The ancient Egyptians were among the first people in recorded history to develop anything resembling systematic medicine, and their medical texts, particularly the Ebers Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and the Kahan Papyrus, are extraordinary documents. They show a culture that combined careful empirical observation with magical and religious practice, that treated the body as both a physical system requiring physical treatment and a spiritual one requiring spiritual attention, and that understood health as a condition of balance, the right relationship between the physical and spiritual aspects of the self, and between the self and the cosmic order. Sleep appeared in Egyptian medicine in several important ways. First, sleep was itself understood as a healing state. When the body was ill, rest and sleep were often prescribed, not just as common sense, though it was that too, but as active medicine. The sleeping body was understood to be in a state of heightened receptivity to divine healing. The Ba, moving freely during sleep, could seek out and contact healing deities, could receive guidance about appropriate treatments, could be touched and treated directly by divine beings in the dream space. Illness that was resistant to waking treatment might be addressed more effectively during sleep. This is why the incubation temples associated with healing deities, particularly Imhotep and later Serapis, were so important. They were not just places to receive dream messages, they were places to receive healing directly, mediated through the condition of sleep. The sleeper who spent the night in Imhotep's temple was not just waiting for information about a cure. They were exposing themselves to healing, placing themselves in the path of divine medical attention, trusting that the sleeping state made them accessible to treatment in ways that waking life did not. The Ebers Papyrus, which dates to around 1550 BCE and is one of the most comprehensive medical documents from the ancient world, includes numerous prescriptions that were intended to be used in connection with sleep. There were preparations to encourage sleep, sedative compounds essentially, made from natural materials. There were preparations to discourage nightmares. There were preparations to be taken upon waking that were understood to address conditions that had developed during sleep or that had been diagnosed through dream observation. Among the sleep-inducing preparations in Egyptian medical texts, we find preparations containing opium known to the Egyptians and used carefully in medical contexts, preparations containing mandrake, a plant with sedative properties that the Egyptians called plant of Shu, and various herbal preparations containing compounds we would recognize today as having mild sedative or anxiolytic effects, chamomile, valerian, blue lotus. The blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, is particularly interesting. It is not actually a lotus in the botanical sense, but a water lily that bloomed abundantly along the Nile and was one of the most pervasive symbols in Egyptian art and culture. It appeared everywhere, in paintings, in jewelry, and architectural decoration, in the hands of banquet guests floating in decorative pools. The Egyptians loved it for its beauty and its scent, but the blue lotus also has psychoactive properties. It contains compounds, luciferin and apomorphine, that have mild sedative, analgesic, and euphoric effects, and that may also enhance dream vividness. When soaked in wine or beer and consumed, these effects are more pronounced. There is considerable evidence that blue lotus preparations were consumed at Egyptian banquets and festivals, and it is not unreasonable to suggest that they were also consumed specifically in preparation for sleep and dreaming. The Egyptians were sophisticated pharmacologists. They worked with an extensive materia medica, hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances with understood medical properties. Their prescriptions were often complex, combining multiple ingredients in specific proportions, and the Ebers Papyrus includes discussion of dosage, preparation methods, and expected effects. These were not random folk remedies. They were the product of generations of observation and refinement. Let us talk about what the Egyptians understood about the body during sleep, because their understanding was sophisticated in ways that are sometimes surprising. Egyptian medical thought was organized around the concept of medu, channels or vessels through which vital substances moved through the body. The medu were analogous to, but not identical with, what we would call blood vessels or nerves. They were understood to carry not just blood but air, fluids, waste, and something the Egyptians called wehidu, a kind of putrefying principle that accumulated in the body and caused illness if not properly managed. During waking life, the medu were kept clear by activity, proper diet, appropriate rituals, and the body's own healthy function. During sleep, the situation was more complex. On one hand, sleep allowed the body's own healing processes to operate more effectively. Rest was understood to be restorative, allowing the medu to clear and the vital substances to redistribute properly. On the other hand, sleep also created opportunities for wehidu to accumulate, particularly in the digestive system, which continued its work during sleep and could, in the Egyptian understanding, produce putrefying byproducts that needed to be purged. This is why Egyptian medicine included specific morning purging treatments, gentle laxatives and emetics taken upon waking that were understood to clear the wehidu that had accumulated overnight. These were not considered unusual or extreme interventions. They were part of a regular health maintenance routine, something like the dietary practices of many modern health traditions. The concern with morning purging tells us something interesting about how the Egyptians understood the body's relationship with rest. Sleep was restorative, yes, but it was not a perfectly clean state. It had its own risks and its own byproducts. The body that woke from sleep was not quite the same as the body that had gone to sleep. Something had happened during the night, something that required management, that required the deliberate act of clearing and reorienting before the day began. Egyptian medical texts also contain prescriptions specifically for conditions that we would recognize as sleep disorders. There were treatments for what sounds very much like insomnia, the inability to sleep, or the inability to stay asleep. These typically involved preparations designed to calm the nervous system and prepare the body for rest. Specific herbal compounds, particular foods to eat or avoid in the evening, external applications of aromatic preparations to the skin, and in some cases ritual procedures at prayers, invocations of specific deities, the placing of particular objects near the sleeping area. There were also treatments for what sounds very much like hypersomnia, excessive sleep, the inability to stay awake, a kind of lethargy or heaviness that prevented normal functioning. These were understood as an imbalance of a different kind, and the treatments were correspondingly different, stimulating rather than sedative, designed to restore activity and engagement rather than encourage rest. There were treatments for nightmares or repeated, disturbing dreams that interfered with restful sleep. These combined medical and magical approaches, sedative preparations to encourage deeper, less troubled sleep, combined with ritual procedures to address the spiritual cause of the disturbance. And there were treatments for a condition that Egyptian texts describe as the heaviness of sleep, a condition in which sleep was too deep, too difficult to emerge from, in which the person slept far more than they should and found it difficult to respond normally to the world around them. This sounds, to a modern ear, like it might be describing various conditions from severe depression to narcolepsy to extreme sleep deprivation. Whatever it was, the Egyptians recognized it as a medical problem requiring treatment. What is striking about all of these is the combination of the physical and the magical in a single unified approach. The modern distinction between real medicine and fake medicine, the distinction we draw between pharmacological treatment and ritual or symbolic treatment, would have been entirely foreign to an Egyptian physician. A well-designed treatment addressed all aspects of the person and their condition: the physical body, the spiritual state, the social and relational context. An herbal compound that promoted sleep was not separate from the protective ritual performed over the sleeping area. They were two aspects of the same comprehensive response to the same problem. The connection between sleep and healing in Egyptian culture extended to the deities who presided over both. Imhotep, as we have mentioned, was the most important healing deity of the later periods, a historical person, the architect of the step pyramid at Saqqara during the Old Kingdom, around 2650 BCE, who was posthumously deified for his extraordinary wisdom. By the late period and Greco-Roman times, Imhotep had become the patron deity of physicians and healers, and his temples were centers of medical practice. But there were other healing connections in Egyptian religion that specifically involved sleep. The goddess Serket, the scorpion goddess, whose name means she who causes the throat to breathe, was associated with protection from poisonous stings and bites, including the various toxic creatures that might appear in a sleeping space. Her priests were specialized healers who dealt with envenomation, and her protective function was particularly invoked at night when scorpions and snakes were more active. The goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed powerful one, was both a deity of illness and a deity of healing. She could send plague and she could cure it. Her priests were physicians, and her power over disease gave them their authority to heal. Sekhmet was associated with the dangerous heat of the desert noon and with the scorching power of the sun, not the benevolent sunrise but the aggressive midday heat. She had to be carefully managed, ritually appeased, lest her power tip from healing into destruction. There is something interesting in the Egyptian insistence on the same deity being both a source of harm and a source of healing. This is not inconsistency. It is a sophisticated understanding of power. The same force that could kill could also cure. The same deity who sent the illness could take it away. The relationship between the healer and the healing god was not simply petitioner and benefactor. It was negotiator and powerful being, requiring skill, respect, and the proper approach. This applied to the night too. The night was both a place of rest and a place of potential danger. The same sleep that healed could also be the vehicle for spiritual attack. The same dreaming state that brought divine messages could also bring disturbing visions. The same darkness that protected the sleeping body from the heat of the day was also the darkness in which harmful things moved. The Egyptian response to this dual nature was not to deny it, not to pretend the night was simply safe or simply dangerous. It was to engage with it carefully, with appropriate preparation, with the right tools, with the right protections, and with a willingness to understand whatever the night brought as meaningful information rather than random noise. Life in the necropolis, the workers who built the houses of eternity, and how they slept meanwhile in another quiet corner of history. Let us return to Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb builders, and spend some time there. The village sat in a dry, narrow valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. It was established around 1550 BCE, probably under the pharaoh Thutmose I, specifically to house the workers who would construct the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, just over the ridge to the northwest. It remained inhabited until around 1100 BCE, when the increasing instability of the late New Kingdom made it impossible to maintain, and the workers and their families moved to safer locations. During those 4.5 centuries, the village was home to a population that fluctuated but typically numbered several hundred people. The skilled artisans who actually cut and decorated the tombs, their families, their dependents, and the various support workers who supplied the village with food, water, and other necessities. These were skilled workers. The foremen, scribes, and senior craftsmen of Deir el-Medina occupied a social position well above ordinary agricultural laborers. They were paid by the state in the form of monthly rations, grain, oil, vegetables, fish, sometimes meat. and they received various additional benefits including medical care. There was a physician attached to the workforce, tools and materials for their work, and occasional bonuses of luxury goods. Their tombs, which they built and decorated for themselves, as you might expect from people who spent their professional lives building and decorating other people's tombs, were elaborate and beautiful, far more impressive than anything an ordinary Egyptian of their economic class would typically have. They were also, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily literate. The volume of written documents from Deir el-Medina is remarkable. Ostraca pottery shards used as informal notepads have been found in the thousands, containing letters, lists, legal documents, literary texts, love poems, medical prescriptions, laundry lists, and the records of absences that we mentioned earlier. This is a community that wrote things down constantly, that valued the written word, that communicated in writing even with neighbors who lived a few doors away. This means we know more about the daily life of Deir el-Medina, more about how its people woke and slept and ate and argued and loved and mourned, than we know about almost any other community in the ancient world before the Roman period. The workers of Deir el-Medina had an unusual schedule that directly affected their sleep. They worked in the Valley of the Kings, which was about an hour's walk from the village over a rocky ridge. This walk was in summer through conditions of considerable heat and difficulty. The valley is sheltered and can become extremely hot. To manage this, the workers typically did not commute daily. Instead, they stayed at huts near the worksite during the work week, returning to the village on their days off. These worksite huts were simple structures, small, temporary, not the comfortable homes of the village. They provided shade and some shelter from the wind, basic cooking facilities, and a place to sleep. The sleeping arrangements were minimal: mats, headrests, a blanket for the cold desert nights. The worksite huts faced different challenges from the village houses. They were positioned in an exposed valley rather than a sheltered one, subject to different wind patterns, different temperatures, less protection. The men who slept in these huts were sleeping close to the tombs they were building and the tombs of long-dead pharaohs. This proximity to royal death had its own spiritual charge. The Valley of the Kings was not simply a workplace. It was a sacred precinct, a landscape saturated with the presence of the powerful dead, a place where the boundary between the living world and the afterlife was considered particularly thin. Working in the valley required ritual preparation and maintenance. The workers purified themselves before entering the tomb spaces. They followed various prohibitions: not entering certain areas at certain times, not consuming certain foods during work periods. And sleeping near the valley meant sleeping in proximity to its spiritual field, which was both protected and charged in specific ways. We know that the workers at Deir el-Medina dreamed because they wrote about their dreams. The ostraca from the village include accounts of dreams, references to dream interpretation, and what appear to be records of dreams that were considered significant. These are not elaborate literary compositions. They are brief, informal, written quickly on a piece of pottery. But they give us glimpses of what it felt like to be a worker in the necropolis, to sleep near the tombs of pharaohs, to dream in a place where the dead were so present. One of the dream accounts from Deir el-Medina, rough in its translation as these things inevitably are, describes a man seeing his deceased father in a dream, the father giving him specific advice about a legal matter that was troubling the family. The man took this advice, acted on it, and from the tone of the account felt that it had been effective. This was understood as a genuine communication from a genuine person, delivered through the medium of sleep and dream, in a place and at a time when such communication was perhaps especially easy. The village of Deir el-Medina had a small chapel dedicated to the deified Amenhotep I, the second pharaoh of the New Kingdom, who had died centuries before the village was established, but who had become the patron deity of the workers, the divine protector of their community. This chapel was a focus of community religious life, and it was also a site of oracle activity. The oracle of Amenhotep I was consulted for everything from legal disputes to medical decisions to questions about the future. The oracle worked through the statue of the god being carried in procession, with the carriers responding to questions by moving forward yes or backward no, or by stopping in front of the person or document that held the answer. This was a physical, communal, public form of divination, very different from the private, interior experience of dream incubation, but serving some of the same functions. What is interesting for our purposes is that the oracle and the dream were understood as two complementary channels for divine communication. Some questions were better suited to the oracle, public disputes, collective decisions, matters where a visible and shared divine response was needed. Other questions were better suited to the dream, private matters, personal situations, questions that required a more intimate response from the divine. The village also had at least one person who specialized in dream interpretation. We know this from references in the ostraca to people consulting such specialists, and from records that suggest payment for interpretive services. This person would have occupied a specific social role in the community, not a priest exactly, not a physician exactly, but someone who sat at the intersection of both, who had the knowledge to interpret what the night brought and advise on what to do about it. Imagine the village in the early morning, the sun not yet fully up, but the sky already light. The women beginning the first tasks of the day, grinding grain, tending the small ovens in the kitchen areas at the back of the houses, drawing water from the well in the center of the village. The children beginning to stir. The men who have been at the work site huts not yet returned, they will come back for their days off, carrying whatever they have made or mended during the work week. And in one of the houses, perhaps near the edge of the village, there is someone sitting quietly, listening to a neighbor who has come with a dream from the previous night. The neighbor is describing it carefully, trying to remember the details, the sequence of images, the feeling of it. The listener is quiet, attentive, occasionally asking a question. What was the color? Did they speak first or did you? Which direction were they facing? This conversation is happening in the early morning light, before the day fully begins, in the fragile window between the night and the day when the dream is still present, and the waking world has not yet entirely reasserted itself. The listener knows this window is short. The dream will fade. The information it carries needs to be extracted before it does. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not just artisans. They were also remarkably devoted to their own spiritual lives in ways we can see specifically because of the extraordinary record they left behind. Their tombs, the tombs they built for themselves, in a smaller valley adjacent to the village, are some of the most beautifully decorated in Egypt. Not for their size or grandeur, which were modest compared to the royal tombs they spent their working lives creating, but for the personal quality of their imagery, the warmth and specificity of their domestic scenes, the evident care with which each family chose what to depict and how. Many of these tomb chapels depicted the deceased at rest in the field of Aru, the Egyptian paradise, sometimes translated as the field of reeds. This was an idealized version of the Egyptian landscape: fertile fields, abundant water, pleasant shade, familiar crops. The deceased was shown farming, eating, resting, and generally doing the activities of a pleasurable life, but without the labor's hardship, without illness or hunger or grief. The field of Aru was an eternal version of the best days of ordinary life, not a transcendence of the human, but a perfected version of it. The deceased did not become something other than human in this paradise. They remained themselves with all their specific characteristics, but freed from the particular difficulties of mortality. They ate and slept and moved through a landscape that was recognizably Egyptian, recognizably theirs, and rest was part of this paradise. The afterlife was not imagined as a place of constant activity or vigilance. It was imagined in part as a place where the best quality of rest was available, where sleep, when it came, was peaceful and restorative and untroubled by the concerns of the living world. The dead who had achieved paradise could sleep without fear, could dream without disturbance, could rest in the shade of a divine tree while the sun crossed the sky above them. This tells us something important about what the Egyptians valued in life, expressed through their imagining of what made a paradise. Rest was not a consolation prize or a lesser version of activity. It was part of the best possible existence. The capacity to rest well, to truly let go, to sleep without guardedness or worry, was understood as one of the highest goods that a life or an afterlife could offer. At the pharaoh's court, royalty, ritual, and the sacred sleep of kings, and as the night deepens once more, let us move to the other end of the social scale and think about what sleep looked like at the very top of Egyptian society. The pharaoh's sleep was a matter of state. This is not a metaphor. The sleep of the pharaoh was a ritual event managed by specific priests, surrounded by specific protocols, understood to have implications for the entire cosmic order. The pharaoh was not simply a very powerful person who happened to need rest like everyone else. The pharaoh was the living incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra, the axis point around which the ordered world turned. What happened to the pharaoh's consciousness, including what happened during sleep, had cosmic significance. The evening preparation of the pharaoh for sleep was a ritual sequence. We know this from various sources, from temple inscriptions, from administrative records, from the indirect evidence of what objects and practices were associated with royal bedchambers. The sequence involved purification, the donning of specific garments, the offering of prayers and protective formulas, the placement of specific objects in the sleeping space, and the establishment of ritual protections by designated priests. The bedchamber itself was oriented and decorated with great care. As noted earlier, an eastward orientation was preferred, aligning with the sunrise, ensuring that the first light of Ra's return would enter the sleeping space of his son on earth. The walls and ceiling of the royal sleeping space were often decorated with cosmological imagery, images of the sky, of the night journey of the sun, of protective deities. The pharaoh who lay down in this room was lying within a cosmological diagram, a map of the universe, surrounded by divine presences at every point. The night itself for the pharaoh was divided into ritual periods. Priests maintained vigil through the night hours, performing specific observances at specific times, maintaining the protective ritual environment around the sleeping ruler. These were not simply guards, they were ritual practitioners, trained in the specific forms of protection appropriate to each hour of the night, to the specific spiritual conditions that prevailed at each watch. At dawn, there was a formal ceremony of waking. The pharaoh did not simply open his eyes and get up. The waking was a ritual event. The doors of the bedchamber were opened to admit the light, specific words were spoken. The pharaoh's physical needs were attended to in a specific sequence, and the pharaoh formally acknowledged the return of Ra in words that were simultaneously a personal greeting and a cosmic statement. This daily ritual, the formal acknowledgement of sunrise, the formal transition from sleep to waking, the formal resumption of the pharaoh's role as the living representative of divine order, was one of the most important rituals in Egyptian state religion. It was performed every morning without exception for the entire duration of a reign. It was performed in the temples as well, where the priests who served the divine images performed the same morning awakening for the statues of the gods. The human king and the divine image were treated in parallel ways because they occupied parallel roles. Royal dreams occupied a special category in Egyptian historical consciousness. We have already mentioned the dream of Thutmose IV at the Sphinx and the dream of Ramesses II at Kadesh. But these are just two of many royal dreams recorded in Egyptian historical texts, and they follow a pattern that appears again and again. The pharaoh, at a moment of importance or crisis, receives a divine message in a dream that clarifies, confirms, or directs his course of action. The pattern is so consistent that scholars sometimes wonder how spontaneous these royal dreams actually were. The possibility exists that some royal dreams, particularly the ones recorded in official inscriptions, were at least partly constructed, narratives that served political purposes, framing the pharaoh's actions as divinely mandated rather than personally chosen. A dream from Amun is a better justification for a military campaign than a simple decision by the king, and Egyptian pharaohs were perfectly aware of this. But this possibility of political construction does not eliminate the genuine dimension of royal dreaming. Even if some royal dreams were embellished or invented, the cultural expectation that made them plausible, the widespread belief that gods communicated with humans through dreams, especially with the pharaoh who was closest to the divine, was entirely real. The fiction, if it was sometimes fiction, worked because it was built on a foundation of genuine belief. And some royal dreams were clearly experienced as genuine and troubling. One of the most interesting is the dream of Amenhotep II recorded on a stele at Giza. In this dream, the pharaoh receives a message from the sun god that contains both encouragement and instruction. The tone of the text suggests that the dream was understood as a real event, experienced as real, remembered as real, and responded to as real. The pharaoh performed the actions the dream indicated, erected the stele to commemorate the encounter, and incorporated the experience into his understanding of his own divine mandate. What did a pharaoh dream about? We can only speculate about the content of the dreams that went unrecorded, but the recorded ones cluster around certain themes: divine appearance, gods presenting themselves directly and speaking, confirmation of power, divine endorsement of the pharaoh's rule and decisions, and prophetic vision, images of events yet to come, requiring action or preparation. These themes make sense when you consider the pharaoh's psychological situation. The pharaoh was under an extraordinary weight of expectation and obligation. The well-being of the entire land, the flooding of the Nile, the growth of the crops, the success of military campaigns, the health of the people was understood to depend, at least in part, on the quality of the pharaoh's relationship with the divine. A pharaoh who was right with the gods would oversee a prosperous land. A pharaoh who had somehow offended the divine order would see disaster follow. This is an enormous responsibility. It is the kind of responsibility that would, in any person, generate anxiety. And anxiety, as we know, is one of the most reliable disruptors of sleep. The elaborate ritual preparation for royal sleep, the priests who maintained protective watches, the morning ceremony of acknowledgement, these were not just theological requirements. They were also, on a human level, the rituals of someone managing the psychological burden of an extraordinary role. The pharaoh needed to sleep. The pharaoh could not afford to lie awake in the dark with the weight of the cosmos pressing down. The rituals helped. They organized the night, divided it into managed segments, placed it within a framework of divine care, and allowed the consciousness of a person who was also supposed to be a god to relax briefly into the simple condition of a sleeping human being. Let us talk about one specific pharaoh who has a special relationship with our topic, Amenhotep III, the grandfather of Tutankhamun, who ruled Egypt during a period of extraordinary peace and prosperity from around 1390 to 1352 BCE. Amenhotep III was a king who loved beauty, who built on a scale that even by Egyptian standards was extravagant, who commissioned thousands of statues and reliefs and decorative programs. But he was also, by the later years of his reign, a man in poor physical health, who sought healing with the earnestness of someone who understood that his body was failing. Among his surviving correspondence are letters between Amenhotep III and the king of the Mitanni, a powerful neighboring state to the north, in which the Egyptian king requests the loan of a divine statue for healing purposes. Specifically, he wants the statue of the Mitanni goddess Shoshka, a healing deity associated with love and fertility, the Mitanni equivalent of the Egyptian goddess Hathor, to come to Egypt and apply her healing powers. The statue came, and the healing was sought presumably through the established practices of divine healing and prayer, ritual, and sleep incubation in the presence of the divine image. This correspondence tells us several things. It tells us that healing through divine proximity, including healing during sleep in the presence of a deity's image, was taken seriously at the highest level of the Egyptian state. It tells us that Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful men in the world at that moment, was looking for help in the same direction that any of his subjects might look, toward the divine through the medium of ritual and sleep. And it tells us something about the humility that illness imposes, regardless of power. The pharaoh who was supposed to be the son of Ra, whose word was divine law, whose least desire required armies of servants and craftsmen to fulfill. This man was writing letters to foreign kings asking to borrow their goddess because he was in pain and the night was long and he needed something to help him sleep and heal. There is another aspect of royal sleep that deserves mention: the royal harem. Egyptian pharaohs maintained harems, large households of women, including wives, concubines, foreign princesses given as diplomatic gifts, and their attendants. These were separate living establishments, sometimes quite distant from the main palace, with their own administrative structure and their own daily rhythms. The women of the royal harem had their own sleeping arrangements, their own quarters, their own bedrooms, their own hierarchies of space and privilege. The most senior wives had the most comfortable quarters. The foreign princesses occupied intermediate positions. The lower ranks lived more communally. What is interesting for our purposes is that the harem was a place of relative leisure, more leisure at least than most Egyptian women experienced. The women were housed, fed, and clothed by the state. They were not required to perform agricultural labor or domestic service. They had time for crafts, for music, for conversation, for the management of their children, and they had time for sleep. The harem was also inevitably a place of social complexity and sometimes danger. The political stakes of royal succession meant that the mother of a future pharaoh had enormous potential power, which meant that the relationships among harem women were never simple. The historical record includes several cases of harem conspiracies, attempts by factions of women and their allies to manipulate succession in favor of particular children. But in the ordinary days, the harem was a place of women's culture, and the sleep culture of that space would have had its own specific character. Children were born there, raised there. Illnesses happened there. Dreams were dreamed and discussed there. The female practitioners of dream interpretation, of protective magic, of healing arts, these would have been present in the harem, serving the community of women in ways that the male-dominated official religious and medical system did not directly address. We know less about this women's culture than we would like, because most of the surviving records were produced by and for men. But we catch glimpses of it in the objects found in harem contexts, the small figurines, the protective amulets, the cosmetic items that doubled as ritual tools. The sleeping life of the harem women was surrounded by its own protective presences, its own rituals, its own specific deities. The festival of light, celebration, rest, and the sacred calendar. There is a particular festival in the Egyptian calendar that brings us directly to the heart of what the Egyptians understood about night and rest, and the sacred significance of darkness. It was called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, and it happened every year around the time we would call late spring or early summer, specifically during the second month of the harvest season, when the lunar calendar aligned in the right way. It was one of the most important festivals in the Theban religious calendar, and its character was unlike anything in the modern world, though it might remind you faintly of certain Day of the Dead traditions, or of the ancient Roman festival of Lemuria. During the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, the statue of Amun, housed normally in his great temple at Karnak on the east bank, was carried in procession across the Nile to the west bank, the side of the dead, and moved in a great ceremonial journey between the various mortuary temples and tomb complexes of the Theban necropolis. This was the moment when the god himself crossed to the land of the dead, and the people, the living people of Thebes, came too. They brought food and drink and flowers. They visited the tombs of their ancestors, opened the sealed entrance chambers that served as the public face of private burial places, and spent the night there. Not in mourning exactly, in celebration, in the company of their dead, eating and drinking and talking, and eventually sleeping in the outer rooms of the family tomb, under the watchful eyes of the painted figures on the walls. The rationale was that the statue of Amun, moving through the necropolis, would reactivate the dead, breathe life back into the images and cast statues in the tombs, reinvigorate the connection between the living family and their deceased members. And if you were there, present in the tomb when the god's procession passed, you could participate directly in this reactivation. You could feel your dead relatives become, briefly, more present. You could speak to them, listen for them in the sounds of the night, wait for them to come in dreams. The Beautiful Feast of the Valley was, therefore, a festival of sleep and dreams with the dead. The living families who spent the night in their ancestors' tombs were placing themselves in the optimal position for the dream contact that would constitute the real communication of the festival. The food and drink consumed was shared with the dead, or rather, the dead were offered their portion through the established ritual protocols, and then the living ate what remained and lay down in the darkness and waited. The experience of sleeping in a tomb in the outer chamber of a painted, decorated Egyptian tomb, surrounded by the images of the dead and the spells designed to protect them, was something quite specific, and it is worth imagining in detail. The outer chambers of New Kingdom tomb chapels were relatively accessible spaces, decorated with images from the life of the deceased and from the mythology of the afterlife. In the lamplight of an evening during the Feast of the Valley, these images would flicker and seem to breathe. The figures of the deceased and their family would appear to move slightly in the play of light and shadow. The hieroglyphic inscriptions, prayers, and protective spells would seem to hover and shift on the walls. The smell would be complex, the dry stone of the tomb itself cool and slightly dusty, the food and incense brought by the living families, the residual smell of the mummification materials from the burial chamber beyond the sealed door, the flowers placed on the offering table perhaps beginning to wilt in the enclosed air. The sounds would be muffled. The activity of the festival, the processions, the music, the activity of other families at other tombs would reach the interior of the tomb chamber only dimly. As the night deepened and the activity outside settled, the tomb would become very quiet. The kind of quiet that a stone room achieves, where even the sound of breathing seems to echo slightly. In this quiet, in this specific quality of light and darkness, surrounded by images of ancestors and spells of protection, lying on a mat with a headrest under the neck and the cold stone of the floor beneath, this was the space in which the families of ancient Thebes waited for their dreams. Some of them presumably slept easily, the day's activity and the wine and food conspiring with the warmth of many bodies in the enclosed space to produce simple, comfortable sleep. Others perhaps lay awake longer, listening to the silence, looking at the painted faces on the walls in the fading lamplight, wondering if tonight the dream would come. If tonight the person they missed most, a parent, a child, a spouse, a friend, would appear and speak, and some of them perhaps received what they came for. Woke at some deep hour of the night with the clear sense of a presence, a warmth, a voice heard not quite with the ears. Lay still for a moment, holding the experience before it faded into the returning sounds of the ordinary world. This is what the beautiful Feast of the Valley was for. Not spectacle, though there was spectacle, not music, though there was music. But this, the still center of the night in the presence of the dead, waiting in a state of respectful openness for what the dark might offer. The Egyptian festival calendar was rich with occasions that had specific implications for sleep and night. The New Year festival, called Wepit Renpit, the opening of the year, began with the rising of Sirius and the onset of the flood. This was a powerful moment cosmologically, a moment of renewal and beginning, and the rituals associated with it included specific protective practices for the night of the year's turning. Special protective objects, amulets, written spells were worn or placed in the home on this night. Special prayers were said. The night was considered to be a charged one, full of possibility but also requiring care. The festival of Sakar, the funerary god, patron of the necropolis, often associated with the darkness beneath the earth, was celebrated at the beginning of the winter season. Sakar's festival was a nighttime festival, marked by the carrying of a sacred boat in procession through the darkened streets, by the lighting of torches in the windows of houses, and by specific rituals performed in the hours of darkness. It was a festival of the underground, the hidden, the buried, a festival of the night's own god. The festival of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music, and fertility, was marked in various ways in different periods and locations, but typically included celebratory feasting, music, dancing, and the consumption of beer. Hathor's festivals were occasions of joy, and they often extended into the night. They were not sacred in the solemn sense of a funerary festival. They were sacred in the sense of a divine celebration, a participation in the joy of the divine feminine. Late-night feasting, music until the small hours, bodies resting where they fell, these were part of Hathor's character. And there was the Apit festival, one of the great festivals of the New Kingdom, lasting up to 27 days in the Ramesside period, during which the statue of Amun traveled from Karnak to the temple of Luxor and back in a great ceremonial procession. The Apit festival was a time of public celebration, of increased food rations and festival beer, of reduced work requirements, of the city coming alive in ways that it did not during ordinary time. It was also a time of increased religious activity, of oracles consulted and prayers offered and dreams sought. The common thread through all of these festivals, for our purposes, is the relationship between communal celebration and night. Egyptian festivals, like festivals in most pre-industrial cultures, did not respect a 9-to-5 schedule. They spanned the clock. They included day activities and night activities as parts of a continuous whole. The night hours of a festival were often the most charged, the most sacred, the most intimate. The community that spent a day celebrating together would, in the darkest hours before dawn, have a different quality of experience, quieter, more interior, more open to the kind of awareness that comes when the body is tired and the conscious mind relaxes and something else can speak. Let us talk about the role of beer in Egyptian sleep culture, because it is a topic that comes up more often than you might expect, and that reveals something interesting about how the Egyptians managed the transition from waking to sleeping. Beer was the national beverage of ancient Egypt. This is not an exaggeration. Beer was consumed daily by essentially everyone, men, women, children, as a staple food as much as a beverage. The beer of ancient Egypt was not quite like modern beer. It was thicker, less alcoholic in some versions, more nutritious, made from partially fermented bread dissolved in water and then strained. It was a significant source of calories, carbohydrates, and certain vitamins. It was also mildly intoxicating, mildly enough that daily consumption was not, for most purposes, impeding function. Workers received beer as part of their state rations. Festivals were marked by the consumption of more and stronger beer. Medical prescriptions frequently used beer as a vehicle for medications, the liquid making the compounds easier to swallow, the mild alcohol possibly aiding absorption. And beer was offered to the gods and the dead as a primary item in the offering formula that was carved on almost every tomb and stele in Egypt. The stronger, more intoxicating beers, consumed specifically at festivals and special occasions, could induce sleep in the way that strong drink does. A heaviness, a relaxation of the body, a softening of the boundary between the waking and sleeping states. This was understood and used deliberately. The transition to sleep after a festival was assisted by the beverage of the evening, and this was not considered problematic in Egyptian culture. There is a myth, or rather, a mythic episode that is sometimes called the destruction of mankind, in which the goddess Hathor is sent by Ra to punish humanity for their ingratitude, and begins to destroy them with such enthusiasm that Ra, regretting his decision, decides to stop her. He does so by flooding the fields with red beer dyed to look like blood, and Hathor, mistaking it for blood, drinks it until she is intoxicated and falls into sleep, forgetting her mission of destruction. The episode is remarkable on several levels, but for our purposes, what is interesting is the use of intoxication and sleep as the means of containing divine destructive power. The solution to the problem was not confrontation or force. It was make her drunk, let her sleep it off, wait for the morning. Sleep in this story is a kind of mercy, a pause in violence, a reset button. The goddess wakes and the destruction is over, the rage dissipated in the night, the world intact. The Book of the Night Cosmology, the Afterlife, and what happened when Egypt slept, and as the night deepens further, let us talk about what the Egyptians believed was happening in the cosmos while the world slept. Because the Egyptians did not think that night was simply the absence of day. Night was a positive event, not the mere removal of light, but the active presence of darkness, with its own geography, its own population, its own structure. And the movement of the sun through that darkness was one of the most important ongoing events in the universe. The sun god Ra, or more precisely, the aspect of Ra called Of Ra, the flesh of Ra, traveled through the underworld each night. He left the western horizon at sunset, entered the Jewat, the Egyptian underworld, and spent 12 hours making his way through its 12 divisions or hours, each with its own character, its own inhabitants, its own specific dangers. At the end of the 12th hour, he reached the eastern horizon and was reborn as the morning sun, beginning the cycle again. This journey was not a simple trip. It was an ordeal, a series of challenges, a navigation through a landscape of extraordinary complexity and danger. The Jewat contained not only the dead, millions of them in various states, but also hostile beings, serpents, demons, regions of fire and darkness so absolute that even the light of Ra's bark could not penetrate them. The successful completion of the night journey required the correct knowledge, The correct ritual preparations, the aid of a crew of divine beings, and the active resistance of the enemies that tried to prevent Ra's rebirth. The primary enemy was Apophis, a serpent of enormous size, embodiment of chaos, whose constant effort was to swallow the sun bark and prevent the sunrise. Every night, Apophis was present in the Jewat, waiting. Every night, the crew of Ra's bark had to fight him, subdue him, cut him with knives, render him temporarily incapable. Every morning, the battle won for another day, the sun rose. And every night, all of Egypt's prayers and rituals were understood to contribute to this ongoing battle. The temple rituals performed through the night hours by priests, the hymns, the offerings, the recitations were not just expressions of piety. They were support for Ra's battle. They added to his strength, weakened Apophis, helped tip the balance toward the next sunrise. When Egyptians slept at night, they were sleeping while the battle of the cosmos was ongoing. Their rest was protected by the outcome of that battle, and in a sense their prayers and their piety throughout the day contributed to the victory that made their rest possible. The texts that describe this cosmological drama are among the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. The Amjuat, that which is in the Jewat, or Book of the Hidden Chamber, was one of the first of a series of Egyptian royal funerary texts that describe the night journey of the sun through the underworld. These texts were originally carved on the walls of royal tombs, beginning with the tomb of Thutmose in the early New Kingdom, and they were meant to provide both a guide for the deceased pharaoh's own journey through the underworld and a cosmological map of what happened each night. The Amjuat describes each of the 12 hours of the night in detail, the landscape of each division, the beings encountered there, the actions required, the words that must be known. It is simultaneously a theological treatise, a mythological narrative, and a practical guidebook, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a travel guide to a very specific and very unusual destination. The first hour of the night in the Amjuat is the entry into the Jewat, a passage through the western horizon into the realm of darkness. The bark of Ra entering this realm is greeted by the inhabitants of the first division, the blessed dead, the divine beings who serve as guides and helpers, the spirits who clear the path. As the night progresses and the sun bark moves deeper into the Jewat, the landscape becomes more complex, more charged with both danger and mystery. The fourth and fifth hours describe a realm called the Silent Land, a region of absolute darkness where even Ra's light cannot penetrate, where the bark must be pulled by ropes rather than moving through water, where the silence is so complete that sound itself seems to have ceased. The Silent Land, the hour of absolute darkness in the middle of the night journey, the place where light does not reach. There is something in this image that speaks directly to the experience of the deep hours of the night, that hour, usually around 3 in the morning, when darkness seems most complete, when the world seems most still, when the distance between the person lying awake and the ordinary active world seems greatest. The Egyptians mapped this experience cosmologically. The 3 in the morning darkness was not arbitrary or accidental. It was a reflection of something happening in the cosmos. Ra was in the Silent Land, the sun's light was at its most hidden. The darkness was at its most absolute because the light was temporarily completely gone. In a few hours the journey would resume, the darkness would thin and the bark would approach the eastern horizon and the promise of dawn. But first, the Silent Land, the absolute middle of the night, the point of maximum darkness. In the 6th hour of the night, the middle of the 12, something extraordinary happened according to the Amjuat. The body of Osiris lay in the deepest part of the Jewat, and the sun bark, passing through the 6th division, came into contact with that body. Ra and Osiris merged briefly. The living solar force and the power of the dead were unified for one moment in the deepest darkness. From this union, a new energy was generated, the force that would drive the sun back to the horizon, that would make the rebirth possible, that would defeat Apophis in the final hours of the night. The darkest moment was also, paradoxically, the moment of renewal. The most complete darkness was the condition for the return of light. This is not just cosmology, this is psychology. This is the observation encoded in mythological form that the deepest part of the night, the moment that feels most hopeless, most removed from morning, contains within it the turning point. The moment just before dawn is not the moment farthest from dawn. It is the moment nearest to it. And for people who lay awake in the deep hours of the night when the darkness felt most absolute and morning most distant, the knowledge of this cosmological structure was a form of comfort. The darkness was not endless. The sun was making its journey. The battle was ongoing. Morning was being worked toward, even now, even in the silence of the third hour, even in the absolute stillness of the silent land. You just had to wait. You just had to trust the pattern. There was a daily ritual in Egyptian temples that was specifically designed to support the sun's night journey. It was called the ritual of warding off Apophis, and it was performed by designated priests during the night hours, specifically in the hours corresponding to the portions of the Jewat where Apophis was believed to be most dangerous. The ritual involved reciting specific curses against Apophis, detailed, repetitive, rhythmic curses that named the serpent's many forms, described his defeat, celebrated his destruction. Wax models of Apophis were made and ritually mutilated, stabbed, burned, bound. The names and images of Apophis were written and then destroyed. The entire ritual was a sustained act of cosmic sanitation, a nightly cleaning of the universe, a maintenance of the conditions that made sunrise possible. These rituals were not optional, they were required. The priests who performed them understood themselves to be doing something genuinely necessary, not performing a ceremony that symbolized the defeat of chaos, but actually participating in that defeat, adding their energy and knowledge to the ongoing cosmic battle. This gives us a picture of Egyptian temples at night that is quite different from how we might imagine them. They were not empty, silent monuments waiting for the day's worshippers. They were active working spaces through the entire night cycle, with priests moving through their corridors by lamplight, performing the rituals appropriate to each hour, maintaining the cosmic order through the vulnerable hours of darkness, supporting the sun's journey with word and action and concentrated intention. And outside the temples, the people of Egypt slept, and the temples worked on their behalf, maintaining through ritual what the sleeping populace maintained through trust, the conditions for another sunrise, the conditions for another morning, the conditions for opening your eyes and finding the world still there. The love songs and the long evenings, romance, poetry, and the culture of Egyptian nights. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, let us sit for a while with the love songs. Ancient Egypt produced some of the most beautiful love poetry in the recorded history of the world, and much of it is specifically about the night. About the quality of night, about waiting in the night, about the beloved appearing in dreams, about the longing that darkness amplifies, about the particular sweetness of sleeping beside someone you love. These poems, collected primarily in papyri from the Ramesside period, roughly the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, are striking for their directness, their sensory detail, and their emotional honesty. They do not feel ancient, they feel immediate. They could be written by anyone in any era who has ever lain awake at night thinking about someone. One poem, rough in translation but close to the original in feeling, describes a young man or woman lying in bed, unable to sleep because of longing. My heart leaps up when I think of my love of you. It lets me not act sensibly. It leaps up from its place. It lets me not put on a dress nor wrap my scarf around me. I put no paint upon my eyes. I am not even anointed with oil. Do not stand still, go to him. It tells me as often as I think of him. The description of being unable to sleep, unable to go through the normal evening preparations for sleep, the dressing, the cosmetics, the anointing, because the mind is too full of the beloved. The heart speaking directly, urgently, overriding the normal rituals. This is recognizable across any distance of time and culture. Another poem describes a man who has dreamed of his beloved. The voice of the swallow speaks and says, "The earth brightened. What of my road? Bird, do not disturb me. I have found my brother in his bed. My heart is exceedingly happy. We said together, I shall not go away. My hand is in your hand. I will stroll with you in every beautiful place." The swallow appears at dawn, calling the sleeper back to waking life, and the speaker, half dreaming, half awake in that fragile border time, resists. Because in the dream, the beloved was present. In the dream, they were together. Waking means separation. Stay in the dream a little longer. Stay in the dark where the beloved still exists. The Egyptian love poems are remarkable documents, partly because of what they tell us about how Egyptians understood the dream as a place of emotional fulfillment. The dream was not just a source of divine messages or prophetic information. It was also where you could be with the people you missed, where distances could be crossed. where the beloved who was far away could be suddenly, warmly, concretely present. This understanding of the dream as a space of reunion, of the sleeping mind as a place that could restore what waking life had taken away, is one of the most human things about Egyptian dream culture. It coexists with all the elaborate theological and cosmological framework, with the dream manuals and the incubation temples and the ritual protections. Beneath all of that, at the most basic human level, the Egyptians dreamed about the people they loved, and they took comfort in those dreams. The evenings for ordinary Egyptians were not entirely given over to the serious business of sleep preparation and spiritual protection. They were also, particularly in the long evenings of winter, when the night stretched from early dusk to well past midnight, times of social life, of stories, of music, of the kinds of conversations that happen when the day's work is done and there is nothing required of you until morning. Egyptian evidence for evening social life comes from several sources. The banquet scenes in tomb paintings, those vivid images of feasting, music and dancing that appear in New Kingdom tombs, give us a picture, idealized but not entirely fictional, of what a formal evening entertainment looked like. Guests seated in rows, wearing fine linen and fresh flowers, servants circulating with food and drink, musicians playing in one corner, dancers performing. The scale varied enormously. A royal feast was obviously different from a village gathering, but the basic structure of the evening gathering was widespread. These banquets could last until late at night, or until the wine and beer had done their work and guests were no longer able to maintain the formal posture that the occasion required. There is sometimes a gentle humor in the banquet scenes about this. One famous painting shows a guest vomiting discreetly behind the main group, attended by a solicitous servant. That suggests the Egyptians were realistic about what happens when you combine strong drink with a long evening and good company. But there were also simpler evening gatherings, not formal banquets, but the ordinary social life of a village or neighborhood, the sitting together on doorsteps or roof terraces in the warm evenings, the quiet conversation that happens between neighbors when the day is over and the stars are beginning to appear. Music was part of evening life in Egypt, as it has been in virtually every human culture. The Egyptians had a wide range of musical instruments, harps of several sizes, from small hand harps to the large standing arched harps that are depicted in tomb paintings, lutes and lyres brought in from the Near East, flutes and pipes, drums, clappers and sistrums, the rattling percussion instruments associated with the goddess Hathor. Musicians performed at festivals, at funerals, at temple rituals, and at private gatherings. There were professional musicians, particularly those attached to temples, who had specialized training and specific ritual functions. But there were also ordinary people who played, particularly women, for whom skill with a specific instrument was considered an accomplishment and a social asset. The music of ancient Egypt is largely lost to us. We have no recording technology for it, and the systems used to notate music in later cultures did not exist in ancient Egypt. What we have is pictures of musicians playing and descriptions in texts of how music made people feel, what it was appropriate for, what conditions it created. From these sources, we can infer that Egyptian music was melodic, often employing scales and modes quite different from the Western ones we are accustomed to, and that it was used deliberately to create specific states: joy at festivals, mourning at funerals, reverence at temple rituals, and in private evening contexts, something closer to calm, to relaxation, to the gentle easing of the mind toward rest. There is a type of Egyptian musical text called a harpist's song, a song sung by the harpist who appears in banquet scenes, typically an old or blind man playing the large arched harp. These songs are philosophical in character, meditating on the shortness of life, the inevitability of death, and the wisdom of enjoying the present moment while it lasts. They are gentle, melancholic songs, appropriate for the end of an evening when the feast is winding down and people are beginning to move towards sleep, and the thoughts that come in those moments tend naturally toward the long view. One of the most famous harpist songs, known from several copies, contains lines that translate roughly as, "Let music and singing be before you. Leave behind all evil and think only of joy." until comes the day of reaching the land that loves silence, the land that loves silence. The West Bank, the place of the dead, the ultimate destination that is never entirely absent from Egyptian consciousness, the shadow that gives the present moment its particular value. Even in an evening song designed for a banquet, the reminder is there: we are passing through. The night will come. The land of silence is waiting. This makes the evening and the company and the music and the warmth all the more precious. The children of ancient Egypt deserve their own moment in this story, because the experience of being a child going to sleep in ancient Egypt was specific and particular and worth imagining. Children's sleep in Egypt was managed with attention and care. We know this from medical texts. There are prescriptions specifically for children's sleep problems, for fevers that disrupt sleep, for the bad dreams of children, and from the material culture of childhood. The amulets, the protective figures, the specific deities invoked for children's protection. Bes and Tauret were particularly associated with children. Their images were placed in the birth rooms where Egyptian women gave birth and in the spaces where children slept. Small figures of Bes were given to children as protective companions. The ferocious face and the protective intention were explained to children in terms they could understand. This is the one who guards you while you sleep, who frightens away the things that should not come near. Egyptian children slept alongside their siblings, often in the inner rooms of small houses. The physical closeness of a shared sleeping space, the warmth of other bodies, the sounds of breathing, the occasional restless movement, would have been the normal condition of sleep for most Egyptian children. The idea of a child sleeping alone in their own room, which has become the expectation in many modern cultures, would have seemed to an ancient Egyptian quite alarming. Alone, in the dark, without anyone to protect you, the stories told to children in the evening were part of the transition to sleep. We do not have records of bedtime stories specifically. The genre was presumably oral, not written. But we have Egyptian tales that appear to have circulated orally and were eventually written down, and some of these have the quality of stories designed for evening telling. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor, for example, a man stranded on a magical island, encountering a great serpent who gives him wisdom before the island disappears, has a dreamlike, slow quality that suits a tired evening mind. The tale of Sinu, the courtier who flees Egypt after a royal death and spends years in exile before returning. This is a longer, more novelistic tale, but its themes of exile and return, of longing for home, of the particular quality of sleeping under foreign skies, speak to something deeply resonant about what it means to be away from the place where you belong. The slow season, winter, darkness, and the long Egyptian nights, and as the night deepens, and the hours settle into their deepest quiet, let us talk about winter in Egypt. Egypt is not usually associated with winter, with cold, with the particular quality of darkness that comes in the short days and long nights of the winter months. But Egypt has winters. Not the dramatic snowy winters of Europe or North America, but real winters. Cold nights, early sunsets, a different quality of light, a slowing of the natural world that is unmistakable even under a generally warm sky. In winter, the night in Egypt was long. The sun set early by our modern reckoning. The sunset in Lower Egypt in December comes before 5 in the afternoon, and in Upper Egypt it is not much later. This meant that by the standards of Egyptian life, without electric light, with oil lamps that were precious enough to be used sparingly, the dark hours were very long indeed. What did people do with long winter nights? They slept more. This is the simple answer, and probably the most accurate one. The human body, in a world governed by natural light, responds to longer nights by sleeping more of them. Studies of contemporary populations in traditional societies, particularly in places that still experience natural light cycles without significant electric lighting, have found that winter sleep is longer than summer sleep, that the natural human response to seasonal darkness is to rest more deeply and more completely. The Egyptians in winter would have gone to bed earlier and risen later, simply following the light. They would have spent more of their waking hours in lamplight, the expensive, somewhat dim lamplight of sesame oil or castor oil, and more of their hours in sleep. The rhythm of the winter day was slower, more interior, more given to the activities that could be done in small spaces with limited light, weaving, carving, mending, telling stories, praying, dreaming. Winter was also the season of certain important religious observances. The festival of Sakar, which we mentioned earlier, fell in the winter months, and its darkness and interiority were well suited to the season. The festival was explicitly nocturnal, a festival of the underworld, of the dark beneath the earth, celebrated at the time of year when the earth's own darkness was most present. Other winter observances were similarly interior, similarly concerned with the relationship between the living and the dead. The logic was partly practical. Winter, when the crops were growing but not yet harvested, when the flood was long past and the next flood not yet near, was a time of relative calm and reflection. And it was partly cosmological. Winter, when the sun was weakest, when the days were shortest, was the time when the forces of darkness were most powerful, when Apophis was strongest, when the cosmic balance required the most careful attention. The response to this cosmological vulnerability was increased ritual activity and increased attention to the protective practices associated with sleep. In winter, the evening preparations for sleep might be more elaborate, more incense, more prayer, more careful attention to the placement of protective objects. Not because winter nights were literally more dangerous, but because the cosmological conditions of winter made it appropriate to be more attentive. This is a beautiful aspect of Egyptian religious culture, the alignment of personal practice with cosmic conditions. You are not performing the same ritual every day regardless of context. You are responsive to the season, to the cosmic moment, to the quality of the night you are entering. The ritual for sleeping in summer was not identical to the ritual for sleeping in winter. The protection needed on the night of a festival was not identical to the protection needed on an ordinary night. This responsiveness required knowledge of the calendar, of the cosmic events associated with each time of year, of the specific deities and forces that were active at each moment. This knowledge was distributed through the culture in various ways, through the priestly class who maintained the precise calendar and performed the state rituals, through local and village practitioners who translated this knowledge into everyday practice, and through the oral traditions of the household, the things that mothers and grandmothers and older neighbors knew and passed on to those who came after them. In the long winter evenings, stories were told. Egypt had a rich oral literary tradition that was also in part a written tradition, stories that circulated orally and were also written down on papyrus for preservation and reference. The stories covered a wide range: myths of the gods, tales of adventure and magic, stories of love and loss, tales of the underworld and its inhabitants. Many of these stories have a quality that is perfectly suited to the long winter evening. They are unhurried, full of detail, comfortable with digressions and elaborations, designed to be told slowly over a long period of time. The kind of story you can begin before the evening meal and still not finish by the time the lamp begins to gutter. The kind of story that a good storyteller can expand or contract depending on the audience, adding more detail when everyone is still fully awake, speeding up slightly when the children's eyes begin to close. The stories of Sinu and the shipwrecked sailor that we have already mentioned, and many others, the tale of the two brothers with its themes of betrayal and magical transformation, the tale of the eloquent peasant with its long speeches of justice and the impossibility of injustice in an ordered world. These were the stories that filled Egyptian winter evenings. They were told in the lamplight, with the darkness outside pressing against the shuttered windows, with the smell of the lamp oil and perhaps a little incense, with bodies arranged comfortably on mats and cushions, with the warm beverage of the evening in hand. And at some point the story would not quite end but simply stop, because the storyteller had noticed that half the audience was asleep and there was no point continuing. The story would be there tomorrow. The winter was long. There would be other evenings. The coming of morning, sunset, silence, and the gift of rest, and as the night deepens one final time, let us begin our long, slow return toward dawn. We have traveled far tonight. We have walked through Egyptian villages and royal palaces, through temple precincts and workers' huts, through the cosmological landscape of the Jewat and the intimate darkness of a child's sleeping room. We have looked at beds and headrests, at protective guards and troubling demons, at the dreams of pharaohs and the love poems of ordinary people who lay awake in the dark thinking about someone they missed. Let us slow down now, as the night enters its deepest hours, and simply rest in this world for a little while longer. The Egypt we have been exploring existed across an enormous span of time, more than 3,000 years of continuous civilization. From the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE to the end of the Ptolemaic period in 30 BCE. In all those centuries, many things changed. The language evolved, the religion developed and transformed, the political structure rose and fell through cycles of unification and fragmentation. Foreign peoples came and went and sometimes stayed and blended. But some things remained remarkably consistent. The Nile flooded, the crops grew, the stars wheeled overhead, the sun set in the west and rose in the east. And people lay down each night under the protection of their household gods with their headrests beneath their necks and entered the darkness. This consistency, the fact that the basic conditions of Egyptian sleep remained similar across 3 millennia, gives the topic a particular quality of depth. We are not talking about a moment in history. We are talking about the experience of millions of people across hundreds of generations, each one going to sleep and waking up, each one dreaming and interpreting dreams, each one navigating the relationship between the safety of the sleeping space and the charged complexity of the night beyond it. In the final hours of the Egyptian night, the 9th, 10th, 11th hours of the Amjuat, the sun bark was approaching the eastern horizon. The battle with Apophis was being won. The crew of the bark was reassembling around the reborn sun. The darkness was beginning, so slightly that it was barely perceptible to thin. In this phase, the beings of the underworld who had accompanied the sun on its journey were preparing to return to their positions, to take their places for another day in the landscape of the Juat, waiting for the bark to pass through again the following night. The blessed dead who had received the light of the passing sun during the night were settling back into their existence, sustained for another day by that encounter. And on the earth above, something was shifting too. The animals who waked before dawn were beginning to stir. The ibis would start to move along the waterline. The hoopoe would sound its first call somewhere in the date palms. The sky would begin so slightly that only the sharpest eye would notice to shift from black to the darkest possible shade of blue. This was the moment the Egyptians called the first hour, not the first hour of the night, but the first hour of the coming day, the hour when the light was still nowhere to be seen but was already, somewhere below the eastern horizon, beginning its approach. The priests in the temples who had maintained their vigil through the night would be intensifying their rituals in these final hours, supporting the sun's emergence, preparing the way for Ra's rebirth. And the sleeping people of Egypt, in their village houses and palace apartments and workers' huts and nomadic camps along the desert edge, were in the deepest, most restorative part of their sleep. The paradox of sleep is that the hour before dawn is often the hour of the most profound rest and the most vivid dreams. The body, having repaired and restored itself through the earlier hours, has settled into a rhythm of deep dreaming that produces the clearest, most memorable images of the night. The Ba in Egyptian understanding was beginning its return. The dream journey was approaching its conclusion. The images that had been forming in the sleeping mind were taking their final shape, completing the narrative of the night in ways that would be most easily remembered upon waking. There is an Egyptian hymn to the rising sun, a sunrise hymn, that is one of the most beautiful things to come out of that civilization, and we should let it rest in this story even if we cannot reproduce its precise words. The hymn greets Ra at the moment of his emergence on the eastern horizon, salutes his return, celebrates the miracle of another sunrise successfully accomplished. It is a hymn of profound relief and gratitude, of acknowledgement that what seemed impossible, the return of light from the absolute darkness, has happened again. These hymns were sung by priests at the moment of first light. They were sung in temples where the orientations of doorways and shafts had been carefully calculated to catch the first rays of the rising sun and draw them deep into the inner sanctuary, illuminating the face of the divine statue at the precise moment of the sun's appearance on the horizon. But they were also sung in simpler forms by ordinary people. The morning prayer, the morning acknowledgement of the sun, was part of daily life at every social level. You opened your eyes, you saw the light, and you said something, a word, a phrase, a simple recognition of the fact that Ra had made it through again, that you had made it through again, that the night was complete and the day was beginning and the cosmos had held together for another rotation. This act of morning acknowledgement is, I think, one of the most profound practices the Egyptians have left us. Not the elaborate theology, not the monumental architecture, not the mummification rituals or the Book of the Dead, though all of those are remarkable. But this, the simple daily practice of noticing that the light has returned and saying something about it, of treating each sunrise as the miracle it actually is, of never quite taking the morning for granted. We have been together for a long time tonight. You may be close to sleep already. If so, let it come. Everything important has already been said. Everything important has already arrived. But let us spend a few more minutes in Egypt as the dawn approaches and the world begins its slow, unhurried return to waking. The woman in the village house on the edge of the floodplain is beginning to stir, not fully awake yet, but the body beginning its quiet negotiations with the coming day. The smell of the morning air, cooler and cleaner than the night air, is coming in through the high window. The lamp burned out hours ago. The room is lit only by that faint pre-dawn grayness, that first intimation of light, that quality of air that the Egyptians would have recognized immediately as the moment when Nut is releasing the sun from her body, when the darkness is giving back what it borrowed. The headrest is still beneath her neck. The linen covering is warm. The painted bess on the wall is still there, ferocious face turned outward, watching the threshold. Tauret stands in her painted alcove, pendulous and steady, the Sa symbol of protection still in her painted hand. On the roof of the temple across the village, a priest is singing. The words are too far away to make out, just the tone of them rising and falling with the rhythm of the hymn. But the sound, faint as it is part of the soundscape of this moment, the moment between sleep and waking, between night and day, between the Egypt of the night and the Egypt of the morning. The ibis has started. The hoopoe has started. A dog somewhere in the village makes one sound and then falls silent again. The sky now, if you look up through that high window, is not black, it is not quite blue. It is something in between, a color that does not have a good name in any language, but that every person who has ever been awake before dawn has seen and felt. The color of the world just before Ra shows his face. This has been our night in ancient Egypt. In the houses of Deir el-Medina, the workers are beginning to move, gathering their tools for the walk over the ridge to the valley of the royal tombs. They have slept, some well, some less so, some with dreams worth remembering and some without. They carry whatever the night gave them, a message from a deceased father, a reassurance from a familiar god, a troubling image that will need to be interpreted, or simply the ordinary, unglamorous gift of enough sleep to do the day's work. In the palace at Thebes or Memphis or Pyramus, the pharaoh is being attended to in the formal morning sequence. The opening of the doors, the first light admitted, the words spoken to mark the return of consciousness. The son of Ra has survived another night. The son of Ra will face another day. The ritual is performed as it has been performed every morning for generations, will be performed every morning for generations more. In the temples, the night shift is ending and the morning shift beginning. The statues of the gods are being attended to, cleaned, dressed, offered their morning meal, addressed in the words of the morning hymn. The night's rituals of protection and sustentation are giving way to the morning's rituals of awakening and restoration. And across the length of the Nile, from the marshy delta in the north to the granite cataract in the south, people are opening their eyes, seeing light, feeling the particular quality of morning air, cooler and more particular than the air of any other time of day. Carrying their dreams with them into the first minutes of waking, that fragile window when the night's messages are still accessible, still present, still potentially useful. What have we learned tonight from sleeping with ancient Egypt? We have learned that sleep has always been more than rest. It has always been more than the body's maintenance cycle, more than the brain's housekeeping period. In every human culture that has left records deep enough to examine, sleep is a charged event, a threshold crossing, a temporary leave-taking, a condition of both vulnerability and possibility. The Egyptians were particularly articulate about this, particularly attentive to the full complexity of what sleep involved. They gave it theology and medicine and poetry and art. They built specific protective architecture around it. They developed detailed practices for preparing for it, navigating it, remembering what it brought and responding appropriately to what it offered. But at the heart of all this sophistication, there was something very simple, the daily experience of lying down in the dark and trusting the darkness. Trusting that the light would return, trusting that the body would be cared for during its absence from waking life. Trusting that the dreams that came were worth attending to, that the beings who appeared in them were real, that the messages they carried mattered. This trust, calibrated, protected, ritually supported, but ultimately a trust, is the thing that allowed an entire civilization to sleep. For 3,000 years, people lay down on the banks of the Nile under the stars that were the souls of the blessed dead, in the darkness that contained the sun on its night journey, and they trusted. And every morning the sun came back. And every morning they opened their eyes and acknowledged the miracle and began another day. The headrest beneath your neck, metaphorically, wherever you are resting right now, has been there a long time. The practice of lying down carefully in the dark, of protecting the sleeping space with whatever you have that feels protective, of trusting the darkness to give you back. This practice goes so far back that Egypt is not even its beginning. Egypt is simply one of the places where it was most carefully thought about, most beautifully preserved, most fully documented. You are part of a very long line of people who have lain down in the dark and hoped for good dreams. The night is a generous thing in the end. It takes the weariness of the day and does something with it. It takes the body's accumulated strain and quietly, persistently repairs it. It takes the mind, so full during the day of its urgent concerns, and gives it the wide open space of the dream to move through. The Egyptians understood all of this. They understood it theologically, medically, poetically, cosmologically. They surrounded it with the richest and most complex framework of meaning that any culture has ever built around the simple act of sleep. And at the center of all that richness, at the center of the theology and the medicine and the poetry and the art, was just this: a person lying down, the dark coming in, the stars overhead, the river moving, always moving, never stopping, and the breath slowing, deepening, settling, and sleep arriving quietly the way it always does, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, the way the night itself arrives. 1 degree of light at a time, 1 degree of silence at a time, until you are there. In the Egyptian understanding, there is a God who watches this moment, the moment when consciousness lets go, when the Ba lifts from the body and begins its wandering. His name, this quiet God of the threshold, is not important right now. What matters is the idea of him, a presence at the edge of sleep, witnessing the crossing, making note of it, holding the space. You do not need to do anything. You do not need to prepare more, protect more, think more. Everything that needed to be done has been done. The evening rituals are complete. The protective presences are in their places. The headrest is positioned correctly. The breath is slowing, deepening, doing what breath does when the body finally lets it. The river is still moving. Somewhere far away and very close at the same time, the river is still moving. The stars overhead, not stars, the stars of the transfigured dead, the circumpolar ones that never set, the ones that wheel around the pole in their slow eternal rotation, are still there. Were there last night, will be there tomorrow night. The sun is somewhere below the horizon, making its journey, doing its work, accompanied by its divine crew moving toward morning. It does not need your help tonight. It will come back without your assistance. It always does. You can let go now. The darkness is safe. The darkness has always been safe. Ra is on his way, and you are dreaming. Thank you for traveling with me tonight through the long nights of ancient Egypt, through the Valley of the Kings and the workers' village and the lamplight of ordinary houses on the edge of the river. If you found yourself resting, even sleeping during this journey, then this was exactly what it was meant to be. There are more stories waiting, more nights to spend in other corners of history. If you would like to find them, you know where we are. Sleep well. The river is still moving.